In the year 604 of the Common Era, Pope Gregory I sent a letter to the Bishop of London, Abbot Mellitus. This is what he said.
After long deliberation about the English people, pagan temples of that race should by no means be destroyed, but only the idols in them. To consecrate these places, take holy water and sprinkle it in these shrines. Build altars and place relics in them. For if the shrines are well built, it is essential that they should be changed from the worship of devils to the service of the true God. So on the day of dedication, or the festivals of the holy martyrs, whose relics are deposited there, let the pagans make themselves huts from the branches of trees around the churches, which have been converted out of shrines, and let them celebrate in their own solemnity with religious feasts. The rites they once performed to the devil, let them perform to the true God. For there is no doubt that it is impossible to cut off everything at once from their rude natures, because he who endeavors to ascend to the highest place rises by degrees or steps, and not by leaps.
In my opinion, this strategy of co-opting pagan rites and Christianizing them and purifying them is ripped straight from the playbook of Paul himself, who says, I am a Jew to the Jews so I may win over the Jews, and I am a Gentile to the Gentile so I may win over the Gentiles. I'm under the law to those who are under the law so I can win over those under the law. And then I'm not under the law for those who are not under the law so I can win over those not under the law. Ancient people, as brilliant as they were, did not know about the Earth's orbit around the sun, but they still observed the movements of the heavens by charting down patterns of celestial bodies, traversing the sky every day, week by week, month by month, all year round, jotting down certain times and events as recorded in the sky. And they would celebrate these phenomena on annual dates, told stories about what omens they bring and how they represent the inner mysteries of the gods. Most important were the equinoxes and the solstices, which measured the time of daylight in a 24-hour period and the course of the sun as it appeared to move through the sky. The Julian calendar, constructed by Julius Caesar after the civil wars against Pompey, placed the winter solstice on December 25th and marked the end of the longest 3 nights of the year, in which the sun would appear to traverse the sky at its lowest height of the year. So low, in fact, that the 3 days leading to the solstice, the sun appears to rise and set in the same place. That phenomenon produced the Latin phrasing from which the word solstice was derived, meaning sun stands still. And after this long period, the solstice marks the beginning of the rise of daylight, every day gradually gaining more and more daylight for the next 6 months, until the summer solstice, which would then mark the reversal. Those 3 nights in December also directly followed the last day of the 7-day festival known as Saturnalia, sometimes 5 days or 3 days, but always ended on what was known as the Sigillaria on December 23rd, the night of lights, merrymaking, revelry, gift-giving, holiday festivities, closing down all business, and treating people kindly as equals. This sigillaria marked the first day of that 3-day winter solstice, and as soon as the solstice was observed and passed, after December 25th, the next festival of the new year, known as the Calends of Janus, was to commence, which is also a time of decorating houses with greenery, hanging wreaths, lighting candles, and even more gift-giving, and businesses would still be closed, making most of the entire month of December the most celebrated, most jolly, most joyful holiday season of the 12-month calendar, just as it still is today in 2023. In this video, we will be doing a deep dive into the history of the winter holiday season throughout ancient history and Christmas, and try to paint a picture as to why we find this time so magical. Is it just because Jesus was born on this day? Or was Jesus, in fact, not born on this day, and this was always a magical time? And maybe the church just wanted to co-opt an already popular Roman tradition that was too good to ditch. Or maybe it's both. Maybe Jesus just happened to be born on or around a time that was already a magical time to begin with, just by coincidence. And after all, the sources do suggest that Jesus went down to Jerusalem during Passover, which also coincides with the spring equinox, and was thus crucified around another celestial event. So maybe it could be also true that he was born during a solstice. Let's explore this. What do the sources say? Subscribe, comment, like, and share. Before we start, I have some great news for everyone today. This video is sponsored by Atlas VPN. Now back to the video. The Babylonian month Tebetu, Ara Tebetum, or Tevet in Hebrew, a cuneiform tablet from the Hellenistic period, describes a ceremonial procession to mark the end of the winter solstice, which equates to the modern equivalent of January 5th. This marked the end of a 12-day period in which Babylonians perceived the sun to stand still in the heavens. As a result, the winter solstice was celebrated in Assyria and Babylonia during the month of Tevet, when the lengthening daylight first became noticeable, rather than directly when the solstice began. The solstice was marked by special observance, during which the cultic statues of the goddess Kazbaba, Akkadian word which can be translated as sexual attraction, a goddess like Venus, who's the goddess of love and sex, and she was set up in the temple of Borsippa, the ancient site where a ziggurat was dug up and rumored by Muslims to be the Tower of Babel. And here, the goddess was adorned in the temple and brought on a 4-parasoth, which is equal to about 14 miles, procession to Babylon, where they joined her statue with the statue of Bel Marduk in the Temple of Babylon, not far from the Hanging Gardens. They performed a ritual marriage between the two gods, and these two gods were the regulators of sunlight in ancient Babylonian religion. And the journey of Gazbaba and Bel from Borsippa to Babylon was intended to represent the delivery of extra sunlight to the land, hence the winter solstice and the coming of spring, and the Akitu festival coming in the next 3 months. This was, in many ways, tied to the Akitu marriage between Dumuzi and Ishtar. In fact, Bel was considered to be a later period synchronization of both Dumuzi and Marduk, and Gazbaba is considered to be connected with Ishtar and Inanna in the same way that the Greeks tied Isis with Venus. Gazbaba belonged to a group of deities invoked in love incantations, which also included Inanna, Ishtar, Nanaya. For example, one such text contains the formula Ishtar, Nanaya, Gazbaba, help it. These goddesses are all represented by the planet Venus, just as Aphrodite is, who is far from a virgin. In many ways, this goddess Gazbaba, in name only, reminds me of an Arabian goddess, Ka'abu, who is also represented as the planet Venus, although the former is clearly not a virgin. But Ka'abu, like Isis and Artemis and Persephone, is called the Kori, or perpetual virgin goddess. Here is what Epiphanius says regarding this goddess, giving birth to Dionysus at the winter solstice.
Christ was born on the 6th day of January, after 13 days of the winter solstice and of the light and day of addition. But this day is celebrated by the Greeks and also by the pagans. On the 6th of January, called by the Romans Saturnalia, by the Egyptians Chronia, and by Alexandria, Caesalia. For on the 6th of January, this section takes place, which is the turning point, and the day of light receiving the addition begins, and it completes a number of 13 days from the winter solstice until the day of Christ's birth. Those of the idolatrous religion, the leaders and deceivers, in order to deceive the idolaters who are convinced of these, in many places will celebrate the greatest festival on the night of the Epiphany. First, I was in Alexandria, in the Chorea, that is, the temple of the daughter. For the whole night awakened song and hallowed to the idol, gnashing their teeth and celebrating with the welling of mania. They descend with torches into the subterranean cell and bring up a certain statue, sitting naked on a wooden bier, with the seal of a cross on them, of the forehead gilded on them 2 such seals on each other's arms, and 2 more crosses on the 2 knees, and 5 seals of gold engraved. And they will go around this temple 7 times, circling the middle temple with courtyards and drums and hymns. Come to him underground in the sanctum, being asked what this mystery is. They answer and say that at this hour today the Virgin gave birth to Aeon, and this is also done in the city of Petra, the metropolis of Arabia, which is Edom, which is written in the scriptures. In that idol, in the same way, and in the Arabic dialect, praising the Virgin, calling her the Kori, that is a virgin, and Dusaris, she gave birth to, that is the Virgin's only son. And this also happens, Eliosa, in the city that same night, January 6th, as there in Petra and in Alexandria, Egypt. Epiphanius, Panarion 51.
It turns out that this holy child, born at the winter solstice by a virgin who is called Dusares, is considered by most scholars to be an Arabian Dionysus, a vine god, whose devotees engaged in Bacchic frenzy and Dionysian revelry, just as forementioned by Epiphanius. And it is here in Egypt that we first see any mention of Jesus' birth, known as the Epiphany, to be celebrated at this time. I will get into why they shifted the date from the 6th to the 25th later in the video. Epiphanius argues here that the idea of the virgin birth of a god is not unknown among the pagans, and notes that such an event was celebrated at Alexandria, Petra, and Eleusa on the 6th of January. In the temple of Petra, they chant hymns in Arabic, both to the Virgin, calling her in Arabic Kabu, that is, Kori, or rather, virgin, and to him whom she has brought forth, Dusares, that is, the only begotten of the Master. Here we not only see Saturnalia is linked to the solstice, but also with a similar 12-day period that follows the solstice, as we have already witnessed from the Babylonians who venerate Marduk and Ishtar. It reminds me of Justin Martyr in his Apology when he tries to argue that these pagan myths are somehow copying Jesus, which is absurd. We see Christian apologetic games being played as early as Christianity is in existence.
Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, said, "This do in remembrance of me. This is my body." And that after the same manner, having taken the cup and given thanks, he said, "This is my blood," and gave it to them alone, which the wicked devils had imitated in the mysteries of Mithras, commanding the same thing to be done. The same thing. For that bread and a cup of water are placed with certain incantations in the mystic rites of one who is being initiated. Justin Martyr, Apology. The devils, accordingly, when they heard these prophetic words, said that Bacchus was the son of God, and gave out that he was the discoverer of the vine, and they number and the donkey among his mysteries. And they taught that having been torn in pieces, he ascended into heaven. Justin Martyr, Apology. And if we assert that the Logos of God was born of God in a peculiar manner, different from ordinary generation, let this, as said above, be no extraordinary thing to you, who say that Mercury is the angelic Logos of God. Justin Martyr, Apology. And if we even affirm that he was born of a virgin, accept this in common with what you accept of Perseus. And in that, we say that he made whole the lame, the paralytic, and those born blind. We seem to say what is very similar to the deeds said to have been done by Asclepius. Justin Martyr, Apology.
Justin Martyr really sums it up with this passage right here.
And when we say also that the Logos, who is the firstborn of God, was produced without sexual union, and that he, Jesus Christ, our teacher, was crucified and died, and rose again, and ascended into heaven, we propound nothing different from what you believe regarding those whom you esteem sons of Jupiter. For you know how many sons your esteemed writers ascribe to Jupiter. Mercury, the interpreting word and teacher of all. Asclepius, who though he was a great physician, was struck by a thunderbolt and so ascended to heaven. And Bacchus too, after he had been torn limb from limb. And Hercules, when he had committed himself to the flames to escape his toils. And the sons of Leda and Dioscuri, and Perseus, son of Danae, and Bellerophon, who those sprung from mortals rose to heaven on the horse Pegasus. For what shall I say of Ariadne, and those who like her have been declared to be set among the stars? And what of the emperors who die among yourselves, whom you deem worthy of deification, and in whose behalf you produce someone who swears he has seen the burning Caesar rise to heaven from the funeral pyre? Justin Martyr, Apology.
Both Justin Martyr and Epiphanius have no choice but to attempt to argue that Christianity somehow is original and the pagan gods are impostors of Christ. They have to do this because these gods are so close to Jesus and their rites are being done in similar fashion that it forces them into a corner of needing to argue that devils plan these rites in order to fool people. But all we have to do is see through the apologetics to look back way before Judaism was even created. Before Moses could ever supposedly prophesize Jesus, we can see Egyptians, Greeks, and Babylonians already venerating the solstices and equinoxes. Dusharis, or the son of Osiris, was venerated long before Moses or Abraham was even mentioned. Archaeological excavations have revealed a 3,800-year-old tomb from ancient Egypt, notable for its temple that aligns precisely with the sunrise during the winter solstice. This discovery might represent Egypt's earliest known tomb designed with the winter solstice in mind. The design of the temple's entrance was specifically crafted to allow sunlight to penetrate and illuminate the interior during the winter solstice. On each winter solstice sunrise, the day marked by the shortest period of daylight, both the statue of Osiris and the chapel itself would have been enveloped in sunlight. This tomb could potentially be the earliest one in Egypt known to align with the winter solstice. This winter solstice observing temple is situated close to present-day Aswan and just across the Nile from the Elephantine Island, an area once hosting a Yahweh temple. Numerous Jews fled here after the destruction of the first temple of Solomon by Nebuchadnezzar. But long before that, Egypt's 12th dynasty, prosperous era, often referred to as the Middle Kingdom. This tomb was built in the Kubet el-Hawa necropolis. It served as the final resting place for two high-ranking officials in the Egyptian kingdom. The identity of the first governor who commissioned the tomb remains unknown. However, the second governor, identified as Hakib III, a fact corroborated by an inscription in the tomb and historical records. Both governors held jurisdiction over the adjacent settlement in Elephantine. Horus, who was called Harpocrates by the Greeks, was the younger sun god, equated with both Apollo and Eros, and was the grandson of Amun-Ra, equated with Zeus by the Greeks, and direct son of Isis and Osiris, who the Greeks equate with Dionysus and both Demeter and Aphrodite. This divine child, who we should continue to call Harpocrates, avenges his father's death and fulfills the will of the Father who is in heaven. Why do I bring him up? Because according to Plutarch, he was born on or close to December 25th.
Osiris is being buried at the time when the grain is sown and covered in the earth, and then resurrects when plants begin to sprout. For this reason also, it is said that Isis, when she perceived that she became pregnant on the 6th day of the month of Phaeophi, and she gave birth to Harpocrates about the time of the winter solstice, imperfect and premature, amid the early flowers and shoots. For this reason, they bring to him as an offering the first fruits of growing lentils, and the days of his birth they celebrate after the spring equinox. Plutarch on Isis and Osiris.
Osiris and Isis, just like Bel and Ishtar, are celebrated at this time, and just as the Greeks venerated Bacchus and Venus. Notice how once again the winter solstice is being tied to the spring equinox here, just as the Babylonians tied their winter solstice festival to the Akitu festival, and just as the Christians tied the birth of Christ on December 25th to the Easter resurrection at the spring equinox. The Egyptians had a resurrection for Osiris around the Easter time and a birth for Horus around the time of Christmas. This cosmic harmony between the solstice and equinox is one that is universal among religious doctrines. And again, I just want to repeat this fact. Osiris's resurrection was celebrated by the Egyptians at the time of the spring equinox, just as Jesus' resurrection was celebrated at Easter. And according to Plutarch, the divine child of Osiris, called Harpocrates or Horus, was born at the winter solstice, just as Jesus was born at the winter solstice, according to the 3rd century Christians. And I do want to make this clear. This does not necessarily mean that the Christians copied or stole from them, but it does show us that the solstices and equinoxes are universally important to all cultures, and Christianity certainly does partake in this ancient veneration of these dates. The god Ion is a Hellenistic deity associated with time, the orb or circle encompassing the universe and the zodiac. In the Dionysica, according to Nonus, Ion is associated with the 3 goddesses known as the Horae. He says, "Changes the burden of old age like a snake who sloughs off the coils of the useless old scales, rejuvenating while washing in the swells of the laws of time." Marcianus Capella in the 5th century identified Ion with Kronos. In the Mithraic mysteries, he's identified with Mithras. Ion is identified with Dionysus, according to Platonic and Christian writers, and Euripides calls him the son of Zeus. In the Suda, Ion is identified with both Osiris and Adonis. In the Ptolemaic Alexandria, at the site of a dream oracle, this god is equated with Serapis and is known as Ion Plutonios. And in the Greek Alexander romance, the god Serapis tells Alexander to build a city, which becomes Alexandria, where his father, Plutonios Ion, is enthroned, in reference to the god Ammon. The Alexandrian Ion is probably a form of Osiris Dionysus, the merge between the two, which is also Serapis. He's reborn annually. His image was marked with crosses or ankhs on his hands and knees, and was pointed out by Epiphanius that this god's birth was celebrated at the winter solstice, making him tied with Horus, as Plutarch informs us. His mother, the Quarry or the Virgin, is, in multiple sources, conflated with both the Orphic Persephone as well as Isis and Cybele. All of these conflicting sources make it very confusing to figure out who exactly Ion is, but it brings a lot of context to Macrobius' Saturnalia, who identifies all of these gods as one god born at the winter solstice. Ion is central to the Mithraic mysteries and the religion of the last pagan generation at the time of Constantine that tended to use religious syncretism, which, in my opinion, has a tremendous influence on Christianity and, even in the first century, the story of Jesus. This is what Jesus had to compete with. There is one obscure text from the Historia Augusta that says something about Christians in relation to Serapis. Here's what the text says.
From Hadrian Augustus to Servianus the consul, greeting. The land of Egypt, the praises of which you have been recounting to me, my dear Servianus, I have found to be wholly light-minded, unstable, and blown about by every breath of rumor. For those who worship Serapis are, in fact, Christians, and those who call themselves bishops of Christ are, in fact, devotees of Serapis. There is no chief of the Jewish synagogue, no Samaritan, no Christian presbyter who is not an astrologer, a soothsayer, or an anointer. Even the Patriarch himself refers to the Patriarch of Tiberias, head of the Jewish religion after the fall of Jerusalem in 70 CE. When he comes to Egypt, is forced by some to worship Serapis, by others to worship Christ.
Now, I want to say off the rip, most scholars, when it comes to this text right here, say there might be a lot of problems with it. Number one is because the source, the Historia Augusta, has a lot of misinformation within it. It might have been propaganda. Number two, there's not a lot of evidence to suggest that Serapis and Christianity had anything in common or even got along, especially when you look at how the Temple of Serapis was basically destroyed by Christians and they had a little bit of a war in the streets. But the reason why I bring it up in relation to this video and why I think it's important, because at the very least, the Serapia, which was marked on the Roman calendars for April 25th, the same day as Easter, which would mean this author may have had some truth behind his claims that they had to share a holiday together. And maybe he was just sort of fluffing up the idea they celebrated a holiday on the same day. And on top of that, people in the lower classes that are not ordained bishops and don't care too much about doctrine will mix religions, as we see in the Greek magical papyri. It is not far-fetched to think that those people were mixing together the religion of Serapis than the religion of Christianity. Ancient Egypt's sprawling temple of Karnak was constructed in alignment with the winter solstice at Luxor more than 4,000 years ago. At dawn, the solstice starts as the sun streams into the temple through the eastern gateway, casting its light along the central axis and reaching the innermost sanctuary where the statue of the god Amun resides. As noon approaches, the rays of the sun bathe the innermost sanctum, called the Holy of Holies, for an extended period of time, illuminating other sacred areas of the temple. Currently, the sun stands directly over the Tropic of Capricorn, marking its greatest distance from the equator. To the ancients, this omen marked the coming of new crops and new rains just around the corner as they awaited the spring equinox for the next 3 months. As far back as ancient Sumer and Babylon, the solstices and equinoxes were venerated and marked down. The New Year's, though, was celebrated at spring equinox rather than the winter solstice. The Akitu festival for 12 days mourned for the death of Dumuzi and then celebrated the descent of Ishtar into the underworld and the triumph of their return from the underworld. This would later evolve into the Zagmuk, which celebrated the triumph of Marduk over the forces of chaos. This New Year's season would evolve into the later Persian festival of Nowruz, incorporating elements from both ancient Akkadian and ancient Indo-European traditions into the New Year's and spring equinox festivals the Iranians still celebrate to this day. During the winter, however, Yalda Night was celebrated, marking the beginning of the Great Chela, or the 40 days of winter. This winter solstice celebration would begin with the holiest night of the year, Yalda Night, decorating with green and red, giving gifts, drinking wine, and celebrating. This was included in the official calendar of ancient Persia from a recovered stele dated to 502 BCE during the time of Darius I. The festivities that take place on this night are an ancient tradition. They call this night the night of the sun's birth, Mer. Mer, later known as Mithra, would evolve into the later Roman Mithras. After Pompey the Great defeated the pirate army of Mithridates VI, whose name literally means Mithras chosen, and whose entire nation of pirates were known to be devout worshippers of the Persian Armenian Mithra. Here's what Plutarch says about this. They also offered strange sacrifices of their own at Olympus and celebrated there certain secret rites, among which those of Mithras continued to the present time, having been first instituted by them. These Sicilian pirates, captured by Pompey and made into a legion for the Roman Empire, would be the beginning of the religious institution of Roman Mithras, a new religion molded from the old Persian Mithra, but Romanized, and in some ways flipped on its head. It would spread throughout the legions and catch like wildfire, where we would see Mithraeums being built for the next 300 years, from Britain to Egypt, from Armenia and the Black Sea to Carthage and Spain. Hundreds would be built, and this would become the most popular god of the Roman legions, and he would be identified as Sol Invictus, the invincible sun, sometimes as one god and sometimes as two separate bodies, Mithras and Sol. More on this later. The night of Yalda was a winter solstice celebration of Mer, Mithra, called the sun's birth. The development of the sun into Mithra would slowly evolve from the Sumerian Utu, a god venerated all the way back in Uruk in the Copper Age, who develops into the Bronze Age Babylonian god Shamash. And as the Babylonians would spread their empire west, Shamash will be passed along to the Hittites, who already had a sun god named Shimigi, and the two priesthoods seem to have evolved into what was called the sun god of heaven, a mediator, god of oaths, law, legality, and truth, similar to Mithra, which in my opinion is how Mithra, the Vedic god from the Proto-Indo-Europeans, was converted into a solar deity. During the Iron Age, before the Persian Achaemenid period, Shivini, a solar deity worshipped by the Urartu Empire, showed much prominence and has obvious connections to the Persian Mithra. All of the aforementioned cults and gods would form the basis for the Persian solar mediator, Mithra, a god who Zoroaster called upon to mediate between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. It is on the night of Yalda, which corresponds to December 25th of the Julian calendar, where we have evidence that the Persians celebrate the birth of the solar Mithra. According to Celsus, the mysteries present the symbols of motion of the stars and planets and the passage of the souls through them. With the seven-gate stairway as its symbol, 7 gates are connected with 7 metals and 7 deities. He claims that the Christians borrowed much from this teaching. According to Claudian, Mithra is called rotating the stars. and the Emperor Julian the Apostate mentions the secret Chaldean teaching of 7 rays. Since the end of the 2nd century, Roman emperors Aurelian and Diocletian patronized the cult of Mithras. In the 2nd to 4th centuries, Mithraism was one of the main rivals of Christianity. The movement of the sun. In Pompeii, at the Temple of Apollo, dedicated in 120 BCE by Pythagoreans from Greece, we can see a well-built sundial that was able to mark the hours of the day in a 12-hour period. A genius engineering feat for its day, probably passed down from someone like Archimedes of Syracuse, who built similar technologies and was known to design things that use the light from the sun. The ancient Greeks celebrated a mid-December, early January festival that was 12 days long, called Haloa. Once again, 12 days being a theme for festivals at this time, in which Greeks celebrated Bacchus, Demeter, Persephone, and Poseidon, Bacchus and Demeter being the most important of these gods. Although this month itself was named after Poseidon, Persephone is also noted as venerated because she is the one who was taken into the underworld and taken as Queen of Hades by Pluto. She is one of the gods who descends into the underworld and is able to return like Ishtar. Persephone's annual journey between the underworld and the earth profoundly impacts the natural world, symbolizing the cycle of life and death, as well as the changing seasons. Her consumption of pomegranate seeds in the underworld, depending on the version, binds her to spend either 6 or 4 months with Hades. This period of separation plunges her mother, Demeter, into despair, causing the world's vegetation and flora to wither, marking the onset of autumn and winter. Demeter is her grieving mother, who saved her, and celebrates her daughter's return with drinking Kykeon, a psychedelic potion that initiates of the Eleusinian mysteries would also drink. Conversely, when Persephone returns, Demeter's elation results in the earth's vegetation blooming and blossoming, heralding the spring and summer seasons. Thus, Persephone's emergence from the underworld is not only a sign of spring, but also a powerful symbol of rebirth and renewal of life. Like the Arabian virgin goddess Ka'abu, who was referenced in the previous sources from Epiphanius, Persephone also holds the same epithet, Kori, the virgin, or Kori Soteria, the virgin savior. The Orphic Persephone is said to have become by Zeus, the mother of Dionysus, who, in this case, is called Zagreus, and after he is ripped apart and eaten by the Titans just after his birth, he is resurrected as Iacchus just 3 months later, once again connecting the solstice leading to the equinox. Also, Bacchus, the main god of merrymaking, wine, green and red, ivy and berry diadems, is arguably one of the many cultural influences behind what makes this time of the year so magical. Macrobius, in his Saturnalia, cites Euripides, who lived in Athens in the 5th century BCE and wrote the Bacchae. Dionysus, equipped with a thrysoe pine and deerskin, dances in the evergreen forest. Haloa, primarily a winter festival honoring Dionysus, was also dedicated to Demeter, the celebration of not only grapes and wine, but grain and beer. The festival, held in late December through early January, coincided with the later Chronia and Saturnalia festivals, which, in pre-Roman times of ancient Greece, was celebrated at midsummer. More on this shift later. The midwinter time marks the pruning of vines and the first fermentation cycle's completion, with rituals often conducted by women. The festival's name, Haloa, derives from the harvest activity of threshing, and the threshing floor remained a central venue for harvest celebrations. It is tempting to want to connect the name Haloa to the Indo-European word Yaola, which is the root for the name Yule, the midwinter festival of Germanic pagans. And given Odin's connection to Dionysus in Roman Dispater, as I've talked about in other videos, this becomes likely in my opinion. And since we don't know the exact origins for the name of Yule, other than it's the name of the midwinter festival, this guess is as good as anyone else's guess. The Haloa festival included a feast honoring Demeter and Dionysus, as noted by Pausanias. During Haloa, first fruits were transported from Athens to Eleusis in tribute to these deities. The procession of the gods, Dionysus and Demeter, from Athens to Eleusis reminds me of the procession of the Babylonians transporting Kazbaba and Bel from Borsippa to Babylon, as I mentioned earlier in the video, both being 12 days at the winter solstice too. Sporting events and general processions open to all citizens were held on the threshing floors, alongside a procession for Poseidon, revered as Phytalmios, the god of plants. The feast featured gentle or civilized foods, such as cereals, fish, fruits, and cakes, symbolizing fertility, but notably excluded any meat or flesh. Eleusinian traditions forbade certain foods, like pomegranates, considered inappropriate for a feast honoring Demeter, as it was the fruit that condemned Persephone to Hades. They also chant Iwa in honor of her, who Clement of Alexandria claims may be connected to Eve, biting the fruit which casts condemnation from paradise. Wreathed with snakes, they perform the distributions of portions of their victims, shouting the name Eva, that Eva through whom error entered into the world. The Bacchic cry, Iwa, identified with the biblical Eve, and a consecrated snake is the emblem of the Bacchic orgies. At any rate, according to the correct Hebrew speech, the word Hevia with an aspirant means female snake. Demeter and Persephone have come to the subject of the mystic drama, and Eleusis celebrates with torches the rape of the daughter and the sorrowful wandering of the mother. Clement of Alexandria. The archons of Eleusis arranged the feast for the women, then waited outside, demonstrating the visiting foreigners that civilized foods originated in Eleusis. Some sources even go as far as to say that this event was for women only, and that men had to fund their wives to attend. Mythologically, the festival also commemorates a tragic tale involving Dionysus and the shepherd Icarios, who introduced the vine into Attica. Dionysus, grateful for Icarius' hospitality, bestowed upon him the gift of wine. However, this gift led to a fatal misunderstanding. Icarius' shepherds' friends, unfamiliar with the effect of wine, mistook their drunkenness for poisoning and killed him in retaliation. According to Lucian, Dionysus avenged this by transforming into a maiden, driving the shepherds into madness with desire. When the maiden vanished, their unfulfilled desires persisted until an oracle advised them to appease the gods by dedicating clay models of genitals, a custom that became a part of the festival, the procession of the phalloi. Outside of Athens, and Eleusis in particular, in Eleutherae, the country of Attica, and other places along the coast of modern-day Turkey, was the celebration of the rural Dionysia, the midwinter solstice festival dedicated to Dionysus and Apollo, and the birth of the new solar year. The Orphic hymns invoked by these revelers: Helios, whom Dionysus invokes, and again, Orpheus, who equates these figures into one godhead, one Zeus, one Hades, one Helios, one Dionysus. The festival was closely linked with that of Saturnalia in Rome. Macrobius, in his masterpiece known to us as Saturnalia, argues that Bacchus, Apollo, Mercury, and Sol Invictus are all one and the same, born on December 25th, which was the winter solstice under the Julian calendar. But although Aeschylus first asserted that Apollo and Sol were the same, and taught afterwards that he, Liber, who is Apollo, there is no doubt from these that Sol and Liber are considered the father of the same deity. This, however, will absolutely be substantiated by more liquid arguments. For when the sacred arcane religious observance is held, that when the sun is in the upper, that is, in the daytime hemisphere, Apollo is invoked, when in the underworld, that is, at night, Dionysus is invoked. Now these differences of ages are related to the sun, so that at the winter solstice, he seems to be a newborn child, such as the Egyptians bring forth from the Adites on a certain day, that on a very short day, it is seen as a small baby. His age is set at the summer solstice, when he attains his greatest height in the image of the beard. From then on, by diminutions, the god is represented as the fourth form of an aging man. Likewise in Thrace, the same is to be had. We take Sol and Dionysus, whom they call Sabazius, and celebrate with a magnificent religion. Notice how Macrobius is indicating that these gods are born at the winter solstice, which, in his time, during the Julian calendar, would have been December 25th. Macrobius, in the same chapter, also argues that the rites of Serapis, Mercury, Hercules, Attis, Adonis, and Osiris are also related to these gods, and that the Saturnalia is not just a festival dedicated to Saturn, but also his grandchildren, the dying and rising gods who are represented by the dying and rising sun. Serapis and Sol have one individual nature. Isis is celebrated in conjunction with religion, which is either the earth or the nature of things underlying the sun. Macrobius. Therefore, Mercury is adorned with feathers, as if the very nature of Sol. This is why the simulacrums of Asclepius and Salatus are joined to the dragon, because these are related to the nature of Sol and Luna. Hercules is that power of Sol which bestows upon the human race prowess in the likeness of the gods. There will be no doubt that Adonis is also Sol, considering the religion of the Assyrians, whom the greatest veneration of Venus, Archetydes, and Adonis once flourished. Macrobius lists numerous examples of dying and rising savior sons of gods in relation to the winter solstice, but also ties them to the spring equinox, just as Christmas is tied to Easter. I encourage you to read this book for yourself. I could spend an entire video going over how thorough Macrobius is on this very point. But when the sun has risen from the lower parts of the earth, and the boundaries of the vernal equinox have been crossed by lengthening the day, then Venus is happy, and the field is beautiful with crops, and the meadows with grass, and the trees with leaves. This is why our ancestors called April the month of Friday. Now, when the main reason for the turning of the sun is these ceremonies can also be gathered from this, that when their rite of catabasis is over and the fiend mourning is over, the beginning of joy is celebrated, the 8th of the calends of April, which day they call Hilaria, when the first time the sun extends a longer into the night, Macrobius. This same effect, under different religious names, took place among the Egyptians when Isis mourned Osiris. It is neither in secret nor anything else that Osiris is other than the sun, and that is, Isis is not other than the earth, as we have said, or the nature of things, and the same reason which revolves around Adonis and Attis, Macrobius, Saturnalia. Attis, Adonis, and Osiris are celebrated in their respected regions at the spring equinox, which Macrobius ties together with the winter solstice, as the god triumphs over death. He explains the Bacchic rites of the winter solstice that included decorations with green ivy and red berries, gift-giving, revelry, decorating the houses with wreaths. The name of Apollo refers to soul in multiple interpretations. I will continue the order of the matter. Plato writes the sun is called Apollona. These things, which we have said of Apollo, may also be thought to have been said of Liber, Dionysus. For Aristotle, who wrote the Theologomena, called Apollo and Liber the father of one and the same god. The Lacedaemonians, also in the sacred places, which they celebrate to Apollo, calling the Hyacinthia, green and red ivy, is crowned with the Bacchic rite. Likewise, the Boeotians, remembering Mount Parnassus, was sacred to Apollo, yet at the same time worship in the same place both the Delphic oracle and the Bacchic caves, consecrated to one god, and the divine thing is celebrated on the same mountain for Apollo and Dionysus the father. The rural Dionysia is so ancient that we cannot even tell when it began from the sources. It just seems to have always existed as long as ancient records were kept. It was also known as a lesser Dionysia, and the city Dionysia was known as the Great Dionysia, which was held during the spring equinox. Once again, just like clockwork, we have another winter solstice festival with ties to a spring equinox festival, just like Christmas and Easter, just like the Akitu festival and the Tibetu festivals in Babylon were tied together, just as the Egyptians connected the birth of Horus with the resurrection of Osiris. And here we have two festivals with the same name, same general rites in Greater and Lesser Dionysia in honor of the sun, Dionysus and Apollo. Are you noticing a pattern yet? I also forgot to mention, in regards to the Egyptians celebrating the birth of Horus on December 25th and the resurrection of Osiris on April 25th, you might be wondering if this had any influence over the Romans. The answer is yes. Romans had an annual festival known as the Serapia that is shown on Roman calendars on April 25th at the spring equinox, as early as the 2nd century through the 3rd century sources, and is thus replaced by Easter in the 4th and 5th centuries. And Serapis is a Hellenized form of the god Osiris, who was also syncretized with Dionysus, Zeus, and Dis Pater, as well as Pluto. Tacitus and Plutarch tell the story of how this god came to be. The origin of this god, Serapis, has not hitherto been made generally known by our writers. The Egyptian priests give this account, while Ptolemy, the first Macedonian king who consolidated the power of Egypt, was setting up in the newly built city of Alexandria, fortifications, temples, and rites of worship, there appeared to him in his sleep a youth of singular beauty and more than human stature, who counseled the monarch to send his most trusty friends to Pontus and fetch his effigy from that country. This, he said, would bring prosperity to the realm, and great and illustrious would be the city which gave it a reception. At the same moment, he saw the youth ascend to heaven in a blaze of fire. Roused by so significant and strange an appearance, Ptolemy disclosed the vision of the night to the Egyptian priest, whose business it is to understand such matters. As they knew but little of Pontus or of foreign countries, he inquired of Timotheus, an Athenian, one of the family of the Eumolpids, whom he had invited from Eleusis to preside over the sacred rites, what this worship was, and who was the deity. Timotheus, questioning persons who had found their way to Pontus, learned that there was a city of Sinope, and near it a temple, which, according to an old tradition of the neighborhood, was sacred to the infernal Jupiter. For there also stood close at hand a female figure, to which many gave the name Proserpina. Tacitus Histories. Infernal Jupiter is none other than Dis Pater, a god equated with Pluto, but not in a one-to-one sense, but with much overlap, but also with Bacchus, Hades, and Osiris. Ptolemy was creating a new imperial priesthood, as stated in the previous passage, that included priests from the divine family of the Eleusinian Hierophants, known to the world as the Yaobakoi, but as we will see in the next passage, includes other sacred rites from Asia Minor and the Near East too. Ptolemy sent for this statue, who the god told him to find in the city of Sinope in Pontus. Tacitus relates a miracle that supposedly occurred in which this statue comes to life and boards onto a ship by himself and travels for 3 days from Turkey to Egypt. The story becomes at this point more marvelous and relates that the god of his own will conveyed himself on board the fleet, which had been brought close to shore, and, wonderful to say, vast as was the extent of sea that they traversed, they arrived at Alexandria on the 3rd day. A temple proportioned to the grandeur of the city was erected in a place called Rakotis, where there had stood a chapel consecrated in old times to Serapis and Isis. Such is the most popular account of the origin and introduction of the god Serapis. Tacitus goes on to say, the god himself, because he heals the sick, many identified with Asclepius, others with Osiris, the deity of the highest antiquity among these nations, a few with Jupiter as being supreme ruler of all things, but most people with Pluto, arguing from the emblems which may be seen on his statues or from the conjectures of their own. Tacitus Histories. The reason why I think this is important to Saturnalia in Roman religion is because it highlights the level of religious syncretism that was on the rise in the Roman religion during the Common Era. Christianity is not exempt from this movement of religious syncretism that was taking place at this time. When we look at the midwinter celebrations of the winter solstice, Sol Invictus and Saturn are blended together, and the celebrations of Saturnalia blend into the solstice veneration, as we will see with the Roman Brumalia. Dionysus and Saturn, grandson and grandfather, have much in common. Both chthonic gods, agricultural gods, both of them bring equality to the classes and are thus invoked through revelry and divine mania. The Lesser Dionysia was a Greek winter solstice vine festival, similar to the Thesmophoria, in which sacred games were played. Drinking and festivities occurred, young girls carrying baskets and offerings, and procession of the phalloi. People sang and danced, and choruses chanted Bacchic hymns and performed dithyrambs and paeans in honor of Bacchus and Apollo. Romans also venerated Dionysus during the winter solstice. When it comes to Rome, most people know a lot about Saturnalia, and many know about the birthday of Sol Invictus on December 25th, which I will talk about later. But less people know about the calends of Janus, which is also a time of festivities, merrymaking, greenery, closing of businesses, and celebrating the new year. But what most people don't actually talk about as much, surprisingly, was a widespread Roman festival that took place in between the Saturnalia and the New Year's, known as Brumalia. Literally means midwinter in Latin. A minor holiday of Bruma on November 24th took place, which reminds me of a Thanksgiving like in America, sparking off the holiday season at the end of November. But an even bigger festival of Brumalia took place during the winter solstice, long before Sol Invictus was given his own holiday, and also long before Christianity even existed. 1st century BCE, Varro writes, Bruma is so named because then the day is brevissimus, shortest, the solstice, because on that day, Sol, sun, seems to sit still or halt on which it is nearest to us. Varro. Apparently, cutting down trees was a rite of passage for this holiday, according to Cato. Oak wood and also wood for vine props is ripe for cutting at the time of the winter solstice. Other species which bear seed are ripe when the seeds are mature, while those which are seedless are ripe when they shed bark. Cato explains the ritual of cutting down trees at a winter solstice. Many scholars will say that the act of hanging up pine trees is something that only seems to exist in modern times, but the pagan sources of the ancient world seem to do this rite for certain celestial events such as equinoxes and solstices, and even Christian authors were aware of this. Firmicus Maternus, in the era of the pagan religion, states, in the Phrygian sacred rites of her whom they call the mother of the gods, a pine tree is cut every year, and an image of a youth is fastened on the middle of the tree. Reeds carried by the College of the Canophori, probably designed to recall the birth, exposure, and rescue of baby Attis on the banks of the river Sangarius. Julian. On this day, the Brotherhood of the Dendrophori, tree carriers, cut a pine and carried it into the temple of Magna Mater on the Palatine Hill in Rome. This was a day of mourning. They advanced the claim that he whom they buried at a little while earlier had come to life again. His resurrection is the sprouting of the scattered seeds and the annual turn of the seasons. Firmicus Maternus. Arnobius, in his text called Against the Nations, says, what of the little branches of the tree decked and girt round with garlands of violets? Do they not signify how the mother adorned the pine with the earliest blossoms as a memorial and testimony of her sad misfortune? What is the meaning of the galley with her hair disheveled, beating their breasts with their hands? Do they not commemorate the sorrow with which the tower-bearing mother, together with the tearful Agdestus, lamented the boy? What is the meaning of the fasting from bread, to which you have given the term castus? Is it not an imitation of the time when in poignancy of her grief the divinity abstained from Ceres' fruit? This Holy Week for Attis, celebrating during the spring equinox, starts off bringing in pine trees and reeds, decorating the temple of the Great Mother with greenery, and decorating the trees with images, and placing an image of Attis on top of the tree, similar to placing an angel on the top of a Christmas tree. The 22nd of March, which marks a day of mourning called the Day of Blood, which is the day that Attis dies, and is followed 3 days later by a day of rejoicing, celebrating the resurrection of Attis as the Great Mother makes him into a god. You can't make this stuff up. We literally have a death of a god, followed by a resurrection after 3 days, just like Jesus, during the same exact week as Jesus. For some reason, many academics don't find this to be considerable enough to possibly be an influence on the Christian story of Jesus and the celebration of Easter, but I digress. But as I have laid out in this video, the spring equinox is universally tied to the winter solstice due to both dates marking the rise of the sun over darkness, as why the Greeks celebrated the lesser Dionysia and the greater Dionysia on the winter solstice and spring equinox. And it's why we see the Egyptians Egyptians holding these 2 days above all others. Christians who calculated the death and birth of Christ to be on these exact 2 days would know this, and this cannot be a coincidence. What does that pine tree mean when you introduce on appointed days into the sanctuary of the Mother of the Gods? Is it not symbolic of that tree under which the mad and unhappy youth laid hands on himself, in which the parent of the gods consecrated as solace for her grief? What is the meaning of the fleeces of wool with which you bind and surround the trunk of the tree? Is it not a recollection of the woolen cloths which Ea covered him with was expiring, believed that she could procure some warmth for his limbs as they grew cold? Also, Arnobius, when describing the pine tree ritual for Attis, he also states that this was done on appointed dates, which indicates that this was not only done on the spring equinox, but most likely something practiced on other dates as well. Given how I've already established the winter solstice being universally connected to the spring equinox, I think that is no way a stretch to speculate that this ritual could easily be carried out during winter solstice celebrations, just as we already found in the writings of Cato about cutting down trees on Brumalia, which fell on December 25th during the time of the Julian calendar. But Neil, the scholarly consensus is that pine tree cutting during Christmas was something that only shows up in modern times. To this I say yes, I know, and scholars are correct for pointing out that the sources only show this to be the case in later sources. I admit that I am completely speculating on where this tradition could come from. However, at least I have sources for my speculation. Cutting down pine trees is nowhere to be found in the Bible, and as I've shown, it's in quite a few pagan sources. So at the very least, scholars would have to admit that my speculation is at least possible. Christians did not start hanging up Christmas trees for a biblical reason. They did this for another reason, and in my opinion, I think is entirely possible and likely that the syncretic rites of paganism is the best candidate. In fact, we know that Brumalia was still being celebrated all the way into the 13th century. How do I know that? Christopher of Mytilene, who lived in the 11th century, makes notes about this festival to his friend Nicephorus, who had sent him cakes around the time of the Brumalia. The celebration of Brumalia featured nocturnal festivities, decorating with greenery, wreaths, wearing ivy and berry diadems, replete with feasting, drinking, and jovial activities, just like Saturnalia and just like Christmas today. Throughout the festival, interpretations of prophetic signs were considered as forecasts for the remaining of the winter season, and people would make vows for the new year. Although the 6th century emperor Justinian tried to suppress pagan practices, records such as those by Christopher of Mytilene indicate that this holiday persisted at least until the 13th century. Documentation of the festival ceases following the sack of the capital in 1204 by the Fourth Crusade. It is only after the sack of Constantinople in the 13th century that this festival would cease entirely. But given how influential Romans were over their European neighbors, it is entirely likely that the festivities of Brumalia blended together with the Christmas tide. And given how Saturnalia was blended with Brumalia in later Roman sources, we can easily see how Saturnalia and Christmas would be blended together as well. It is generally agreed that the pagan gods were viewed in the same way that Christians today would view a comic book hero like Superman or Thor. They don't worship them or believe in them, but could get entertainment and enjoy reading about them and making depictions of them in paintings and sculptures. In fact, many historians believe that the fall of Constantinople in 1453 is what led to the Renaissance era. Many of the Greeks who fled the Ottomans throughout the 15th century went west to Italy and Venice and brought with them Greek culture, which venerated the old pagan gods in artwork, something that was not as popular among Germanic and Latin Christians. When the Latin Crusaders sacked Constantinople in 1204, They melted down gold and silver statues of Aphrodite and Zeus and destroyed ancient pagan relics that the Byzantines held onto. Given how much the Byzantines influenced Europeans in later times, especially Eastern Europeans, I think that it's safe to bet that among the lower classes, many of these ancient pagan rites survive. Take the Greek magical papyri, for example. These are a collection of random texts that span across many centuries, and they show a blending of culture and religious ideas being done by normal everyday devotees of gods. Outside of ordained priesthoods, people do what they want, and New Age movements are nothing new. John Chrysostom, the Archbishop of Constantinople in the early 5th century, complained heavily about the societal and spiritual environment of his day, which was heavily influenced by the enduring and widespread influence of paganism in urban life. A frequent subject of his discourse was the presence of pagan customs within the Roman world's culture. In his sermons, he vehemently denounced common pagan entertainments such as theatrical performances, horse racing, festive celebrations associated with the holidays. He specifically reproached Christians participating in pagan activities during Christmas time. If you ask Christians who is Amos or Obadiah, how many apostles there were or prophets, they stand mute. But if you ask them about the horses or drivers, they answer with more solemnity than the sophists or rhetors. John Chrysostom. Just to give you an idea of how terrible of a human being Chrysostom was, his former teacher, Libanius, who was a pagan sophist, who, after the destruction of the temple of Apollo by Theodosius, wrote a really sad lament for the crumbling of the Hellenic culture that he was raised in. And Chrysostom, who was his student, wrote a mocking dissertation making fun of Libanius just for being upset over the loss of a false god's temple. The very things about Greek festivals that Chrysostom rallied against are the very things that we see in Christmastide continue to take place long after he is dead. These lower classes, making up of everyday Joes and Janes, did not care about his ramblings about purity and sanctity. In their indecent nighttime gatherings, women were admitted to the performance. There you could see the obscene sight of a virgin sitting in the theater during the night amidst a drunken crowd of young men madly reveling. The festival was actually the darkness and the abominable deeds practiced by them. It's not just John Chrysostom who was ripping his hair out over pagan culture continuing to be popular among the lower classes. Our Lord, too, is born in the month of December, the 8th before the calends of January. But they, the pagans, call it the birthday of the unconquered, who indeed is so unconquered as our Lord. Or if they say that it is the birthday of the sun, we may say he is the son of justice. And Chrysostom, as well as other Christian bishops, complained specifically against the rites of merrymaking, revelry, gift-giving, chariot racing, and decorations of wreath and greenery, which they were clearly pagan rites. Yet, these rites continued to be practiced by Romans all the way until the end of the Byzantine Roman Empire in the East, and even the end of the Holy Roman Empire in the West in the 18th century. There was just no stopping these rites, as they were popular. Merrymaking and revelry is pagan, period. Christian observance and Christian worship is specific in its practice as pertaining to piety, sobriety, humility, and self-containment. Setting up wreaths, decorations, images, and breaking into revelry is pagan by definition. There is no way around that. This is exactly what these Christian bishops are complaining about. It was a custom of the pagans to celebrate on the same December 25th, the birthday of the sun, at which they kindled lights in token of festivity. In these solemnities and revelries, the Christians also took part. Accordingly, when the doctors of the church perceived that the Christians had a leaning to the festival, they took counsel and resolved that the true nativity should be solemnized on that day. Jacob Bar Salibi. This quote shows us that these very rites were still being practiced in the spirit of the old pagan Roman tradition well into the 12th century when Jacob Bar Salibi was writing this. In fact, The reason why chariot racing was pagan to begin with was because Helios was depicted as a chariot rider, and the chariot races were performed during the solstice to honor Helios, known in Latin as Sol. In the year 274, Emperor Aurelian established the celebration known as the Dies Natalis Solis Invicti, the birthday of the unconquered sun, on December 25th, coinciding with the winter solstice on the Roman calendar. Again, Brumalia was already that Roman holiday before this. And I remind you that because a lot of smug academics, Christian apologists, will leave that out when discussing Christians co-opting this date to make Jesus important. They only mention Aurelian's feast date, which is wrong and shows they don't know the sources at all. In Rome, this annual event was marked by 30 chariot races. These chariot races continued long after the abolition of paganism and were instituted long before Aurelian too, which proves that pagan traditions did continue to influence Christmas. According to Gary Forsyth, professor specializing in ancient history, this festivity likely served as a delightful extension to Saturnalia, the 7-day festival from December 17th to the 23rd, dating way back to the Republic era, as renowned also for merrymaking, feasting, and gift-giving. This celebration would have formed a welcome addition to the 7-day period of Saturnalia, Rome's most joyous holiday season since Republican times, characterized by parties, banquets, and exchanges of gifts. Gary Forsyth, PhD. You cannot, without either lying or looking incompetent to the primary sources, separate the winter solstice from Saturnalia. They are 100% connected as an entire holiday season, period. And this month was capped off by the Calends of Janus, which also had closed businesses and shut down the Senate and government for festivities, lighting of candles, greenery, and revelry. As Ovid states here in Fasti, lest you be unaware of the rules of the different days, not every light bringer has the same function. Nefastus will be the day during which the 3 words are unspoken. Fastus, the day in which legal businesses will be allowed to resume. For as soon as the entrails have been given to the god, all utterance is permitted once again, and the honored praetor has freedom to speak. There is also the day when it's lawful to pen the people in the enclosures. There is also the day which returns on every 9th rotation. Ovid, Fasti, January. That's right, the Senate was closed until after the New Year, just like we do today in America. Emperor Julian, in 362, referenced in his hymn to King Helios that the Agon Solis was a sun festival celebrated at the culmination of the Saturnalia in late December. The idea of venerating the solstices, equinoxes, or celestial events in Judeo-Christian thought was considered heretical.
And lest thou lift up thine eyes unto heaven, and when thou seest the sun and the moon and the stars, even all the hosts of heaven, shouldest be driven to worship them and observe them, which the Lord thy God hath divided unto all nations under the whole heaven. Deuteronomy 4:19. For the customs of the people are vain. For one cutteth the tree out of the forest, the work of the hands of the workmen with the axe. They deck it with silver and with gold. They fasten it with nails and with hammers, that it move not. Jeremiah 10:3-4.
Many scholars will point out that this verse is about Asherah poles and not Christmas trees. And though I agree, I think at the very least these texts show precedent that these types of rituals of observing planets and stars, making objects from trees like idols, is pagan by default. And this is exactly what the Puritans who moved to the Americas in the 16th century decided was the case when they decided to outlaw Christmas and Halloween and other Roman religions that they believed had pagan origins, for preventing disorders arising in several places with the jurisdiction by reason of some still observing such festivals as were superstitiously kept in other countries, to the great great dishonor of God and offense of others. It is therefore ordered by this court and the authority thereof that whosoever shall be found observing any such day as Christmas or the like, either by forbearing of labor, feasting, or any other way, upon such accountants as aforesaid, every person so offending shall pay of every such offense 5 shillings as a fine to the country. 1659, Puritan government. The Plymouth colony governor tried to halt the use of evergreen trees and decorations. He considered them a pagan mockery of the holiday observance. In England, Anglican church leader Oliver Cromwell preached against the heathen traditions of singing carols and the use of decorated trees. He feared they might distract Christians from the sacred event. There is no biblical reason to celebrate Christ's birthday on December 25th, and no biblical reason to practice the rites of cutting down trees or shutting down businesses for any festival other than Sabbath or those prescribed in the Torah. If we do take the text at face value, all we get is the exact opposite. If anything, we get passages that rally against these rites. Early on, we see constant references from the early church fathers who reject the solstice celebrations and don't even want to celebrate any birthday for Jesus at all.
In the scriptures, no one is recorded to have kept a feast or held a great banquet on his birthday. It is only sinners like Pharaoh and Herod who make great rejoicings over the day in which they were born into this world. Origin 250 AD.
But somehow, these sources get ignored when we discuss this topic. Many Christians will try to argue that the gift-giving comes from the story of Saint Nicholas of Myra, or Nicholas the Wonder Worker, a bishop from Turkey who lived in the 4th century. His name, Saint Nick, through Saint Nicholas, eventually becomes Sinterklaas, which has now evolved into Santa Claus. Stories about his miracles are passed down through the Bibliotheca Hagiographa Graeca, dated to 1348, which preserves a text from Michael the Archimandrite in the first half of the 9th century, between 814 and 842. It is known as the life of Saint Nicholas the Wonder Worker. Here's what we are told. After Nicholas' parents had gone to the Lord and left him much property and an abundance of money and possessions, he reckoned that he had God as his father. Gazing chastely on him with the eye of his soul, he firmly begged the good God that he surrender his life and all his possessions, if that seemed good to him. Nicholas did not cease to continually hand over his abundance, to store it up in the secure treasure houses of heaven, so he was repaid in full by the impoverished. After this passage, the story tells us about 3 different poor people who St. Nicholas feels pity for. The first one being a father who was literally pimping out his daughters for money. There was a certain man among those who was recently famous and well-born, and he was a neighbor, his home being next to Nicholas, owing to the plotting and envy of Satan, who always has a grudge against those who prefer to live a life in accord with God. This man was squeezed by great poverty and lack of resources. He had gone from being well-off to extreme indigence. He had 3 daughters who were both shapely and very attractive to the eye, and he was willing to station them in a brothel so that he might thereby acquire the necessities of life for himself and his household. For no man among the lordly or powerful deemed to marry them lawfully, and even the lower classes and those who owned the least bit of something, there was no well-minded enough to do this. And so the man looked away from his salvation, and, as it were, fainted at the thought of prevailing upon God with persistence in prayer. By this logic, he came to assent to situating his daughters in the abyss of such dishonor. Nicholas then tosses a bag of gold into the man's window overnight, and the man finds it in the morning. Nicholas does this with 2 other people as well. There is no indication that this happened during the winter time, let alone on Christmas, and I think it is more likely that this story was written as a way to distance the gift-giving rites from any pagan connection to Saturnalia or Brumalia. And don't forget, Brumalia was still being practiced by Romans in the Eastern Roman Empire where Nicholas lived. Also, in Spain, Italy, and in the Western world, they claim that they gave gifts for other reasons that are not the same as Nicholas. For example, in Spain, they credit the Magi for bringing gifts to Christ, and in Italy, they credit a completely different saint for the same reason. This all but proves that these alternative stories about gift giving, all arising by coincidence for the same time period, are clearly motivated to purify pagan traditions of Saturnalia and Brumalia rites of gift-giving that the lower classes found so popular and the bishops had no control of. And they had no choice but to Christianize them. And scholars, I'm sorry, are just lazy for not recognizing this for what it clearly is. The 9th century text about Saint Nick is the oldest story about Saint Nicholas giving gifts that we have. However, a fresco known as the Charity of St. Nicholas from 720 is believed to be the most ancient St. Nicholas fresco in the West. And here is the moment of truth. 1,500 of you voted in my community tab for the question of, did St. Nicholas or did Santa Claus attend the Council of Nicaea? The answer is technically yes. St. Nicholas is on the oldest list for the Council of Nicaea. There are some lists, however, that don't include him, although for some reason he's on the oldest one, and he has no official quotes stated from the council either. It is said that he slapped Arius in the face during the council. Arius was the founder of Arianism, the main opponent to Nicene Catholic Trinitarianism, the Orthodox religion of Christianity that won the Roman priesthood. In my opinion, it is Saint Nicholas who is given the rites of Saturnalia and Brumalia and thus becomes the saint who purifies those ancient rites. Just as we know that Saint Demetrius, for example, who is also given the rites of the Eleusinian mysteries, and how Saint George is given ancient Druidic rites of dragon slaying, along with Saint Patrick and Saint Orpheus, who, like Orpheus, plays the lyre. And it is no secret that these early saints were given roles similar to the Greek heroes and Greek gods of old, in a way to transfer over the culture to the Christian faith. Santa Claus evolves over time from the jolly Saint Nicholas of the early church to the magical, Germanic, Odin-like Kris Kringle character who is in charge of an entire fleet of elves and reindeer at the North Pole. Some say this is influenced by Yule, Germanic paganism. Others suggest that the elves and reindeer are an allegory of the Amanita muscaria mushrooms that are red and white and tend to grow underneath evergreen trees. Within the Temple of Saturn in Rome was a hollowed bronze cult statue of Saturn, which became the main stage event during the rites of Saturnalia, when his feet were symbolically freed from the woolen bonds that tied him up for the rest of the year. This act has led to Saturn being associated with liberation, certainly a feature of the Saturnalia festival. The inscription on the exterior of the architrave relates to the construction carried out in the 360s and 370s, which reads as follows: the Senate and the people of Rome restored following the destruction by fire.
It is now the month of December, when the greatest part of the city is in a bustle. Loose reins are given to public dissipation. Everywhere you may hear the sound of great preparations, as if there were some real difference between the days devoted to Saturn and those for transacting business. Were you here, I would willingly confer with you as to the plan of our conduct, whether we should eve in our usual way, or, to avoid singularity, both take a better supper and throw off the toga. Seneca.
First thing to notice about this passage is that Saturnalia is not mentioned. December is used as a synonym for Saturnalia, which is common throughout the ancient sources, even outside of Seneca here, because the month of December and Saturnalia cannot be separated. This entire month was the holiday season, just like we view December and Christmas today, as I will demonstrate in this video.
At the Saturnalia and Sigillaria, he, Hadrian, often surprised his friends with presents, and he gladly received gifts from them, and again gave others in return. Historia Augusta, the life of Hadrian.
The Saturnalia during the month of December in Rome was the time of the year where people would celebrate the end of the year festivities. It was a time for being merry, time for jolly cheer, decorations, lights, candles, wreaths, being good to neighbors, drinking wine, and being in good spirits during the darkest week of the year, leading up to the Sigillaria, the final day of gift-giving and lighting candles and celebrations akin to that of Christmas, which was the day before the 3 days leading into the winter solstice event, which was also observed with the same ritual merrymaking and gift-giving known as the Brumalia. For Sol Invictus was given this day as a feast. More on that to come. And this Brumalia festival would blend right into the final week of the year, in which businesses and the Senate floor would remain closed down until after the calends of January. Again, more merrymaking, more greenery, more hanging wreaths, more gift-giving, especially for young children. And this was the merry and jolly season of December, basically as it is today in America and throughout Europe and much of the world. The month of December was always this way, but Saturnalia and Christmas, two completely different things, right? The phrase Io Saturnalia was heard throughout the city of ancient Rome during this month. Io is a chant of triumph and excitement. It's a Greek phrase that comes from the Bacchic chant for Iacchus, a deity who in some ways is so much like his grandfather Saturn, both agricultural deities of festivities in egalitarianism, and Saturn in the later Roman religion that was dominated by Sol Invictus is also tied to the sun, as was Dionysus and Apollo. When the Brumalia festival is covered over by Aurelian's new feast for Sol Invictus in 274, Saturn and Mithras could not be separated in Roman religion at the time, and so Saturnalia, through the celebration of the birthday of Sol Invictus on December 25th, should not be seen as separate other than events, but with connections to each other. The Mithraic Kronos, who stands with the head of a lion, wrapped like Phanes with the serpent coiled around him, holding the keys to the cosmos, and standing on the world as his footstool. This was the very Kronos, known to the Romans as Saturn, that was being venerated late into the last generation of the pagan Roman Empire. And many right now who are watching are probably saying, but Neil, Christians calculated the date of the birth of Jesus long before 274. So that means there's no way Christians copied Sol Invictus. You are wrong. And to that I would say, number one, that is 100% true. And number two, it's also pointless for this discussion. Number three, just keep watching. Before Christianity ever existed, we already see some overlap between Roman Saturnalia and the Jewish festival of dedication, also known as Hanukkah, which, although in the same month, are not exactly celebrated during the same week, but both about roughly a week long, Hanukkah being 8 days to be exact, but they start the festival on the 25th of Kislev and ending at the beginning of the month of Tevet, in close proximity to the winter solstice festival of the late Babylonians, who also celebrate the winter solstice after the solstice is over for 12 days leading into the new year. I will talk about the Babylonian Tibetu festival later in the video, as the 12 days theme comes up again in regards to Christians. Hanukkah, however, commemorates the triumph of the Maccabees over the Seleucid tyrant Antiochus Epiphanes, in which just a small amount of oil miraculously was said to last for 8 nights. During this time, hence the 8-day celebration, the winter solstice. And like Saturnalia, Hanukkah consisted of merrymaking, drinking wine, stopping all business, and gambling. Romans at Saturnalia played with dice, while the Jews at Hanukkah played the dreidel. They both lit candles, and Saturn, the god who's recognized by the Romans on Saturday, shares the sacred day of the Sabbath with the god El or Yahweh. In fact, the Phoenician writers of antiquity went as far as to equate the Roman Saturn with the Semitic god El and say that these gods are actually the same.
The allies of El, or Kronos, were called Elohim, just as those named after Kronos. Saturn would have been Chronoi, Philo of Byblos. Kronos, who the Phoenicians call El, or Saturn, had an only begotten son named Yedud Sankoniathon.
What I find interesting about Saturn in Roman customs is that his temple was also the treasure in the hands of the Saturnian priesthood, who acted as the bankers for the Roman people and held in their possession the gold, the silver, and the treasures of the Republic. Just as in Israel, the temple of Yahweh, or El, was also the state treasury, Saturn is often portrayed in surviving artworks, donning a veil and wielding either a sickle or a pruning knife, and oftentimes winged. El, also depicted as a winged god, just as we see with this image of El from a Phoenician coin. Sankoniathon describes the deity having 4 eyes, 2 in front and 2 behind, from which 2 are closed during sleep. On his shoulders are 4 wings, 2 flying and 2 resting. This symbol shows that he is awake during sleep and resting when he flies. Kronos, or Saturn, is also commonly depicted with 4 wings and 4 eyes. Sankoniathon also describes ritual human sacrifice and circumcision rites being attributed to Saturn or El, in which these ancient rites were passed down to the Phoenicians by the god himself. In the ancient city of Duga, North Africa and Tunisia, which was once occupied by Phoenician and Carthaginians, famous temple of Baal Hamon. Baal Hamon, who is usually equated with Jupiter or Zeus, was actually considered to be Saturn by the Romans, who took over this temple and repurposed this temple as a temple of Saturn. That is why I always say you should never look at 2 gods who are equated from different languages as being one-to-one in comparison. Even Zeus and Jupiter will eventually have their differences in their origins. Ammon, or Hamon, is sometimes equated with Jupiter and sometimes Saturn. In this case, the Roman imperial cult decided that this was to be a temple for Saturn, the successor for the title of Baal Hamon. It is at this location that some Roman writers thought that ritual human sacrifice to Saturn was carried out.
There was in their city a bronze image of Kronos, Saturn, extending its hands, palms up and sloping towards the ground, so that each of the children, when placed thereon, rolled down and fell into a sort of gaping pit filled with fire. Diodorus of Sicily.
Ritual ditches containing votive offerings were discovered in the excavation of the oldest layer of the temple. The Roman temple thus replaced an older Carthaginian sanctuary that dated back to at least the 2nd century BCE. This sanctuary consisted essentially of a wide open space for ritual sacrificing, designed to receive votive offerings for the sacrifices. The Temple of Saturn was built on top of this, which later was repurposed as a Christian Catholic church in the early Middle Ages, one of the many hundreds, maybe even thousands, of ancient temples to be repurposed as a Catholic church. However, before the Christians took control of this building, it was remodeled during the reign of Septimus Severus in the early 3rd century, whose father Geta was himself a Carthaginian Punic, and his father, which was Severus's grandfather, was made prefect of the region during the reign of Trajan in the early 2nd century. And even before that, the poet Statius, during the Flavian dynasty in the late 1st century, wrote about Geta, who he describes as a wealthy equestrian related to gens Octavia, the same family as Augustus. Not Punic your speech, nor foreign in your dress, or in your mind, Italian. There are in the city and in Rome's squadrons those worthy of being Libya's sons. It is during this time, the Flavian dynasty, in the 1st century, in which Sol is venerated as a giant golden statue, which was built to honor Nero originally, but repurposed by Vespasian with a huge solar crown as the sun. The Flavian dynasty also issued coins with Sol on them. who was already at that time synced with the god Apollo since the time of Augustus. Augustus transformed the Roman Republic into an empire that contained hundreds of cults and dozens of languages and made vast religious reforms to keep up with the new gods that Rome was acquiring from its new lands. Many gods were being synced together. One major synchronization is Apollo with the sun. Egyptian solar gods were also being equated with Apollo and Sol. This led to the eventual rise of Sol as a deity altogether. Plutarch in the late 1st and early 2nd century explained Serapis in his many layers, but having solar traits, but also how Horus was tied to the sun and born at the winter solstice. Coins issued with the emperor as Sol, or Helios in Greek, were commonplace during the 2nd and 3rd century. Even though Pompey conquered Syria, Asia, and Judea, Vespasian still had to re-annex these lands in the 70s of the Common Era when they fell out of control. Septimus Severus, whose grandfather was mentioned in that previous ode by the Flavian era poet, was well connected in the Roman Senate even during the reign of Marcus Aurelius in the 160s and became consul during the reign of Commodus in 180. He then came out on top after the year of the 5 emperors and established the famous Severan dynasty, which was also, in my opinion, the beginning Eastern influence over Roman culture that would not only lead to the very changes in Roman religion that gave us Sol Invictus, but also simultaneously gives Christianity a stronghold in Roman culture among the lower classes, military ranks, and eventually higher, more academic circles too, which leads to the moving of the capital from Rome to Constantinople in the 3rd century. The Eastern world just became more important. It was during the Severan dynasty period in the late 2nd, early 3rd century, which we see the rise of Sol in Roman religion. We also see, for the first time in Roman history, coins issued with any Judeo-Christian references whatsoever, which depicts Noah and his wife in the ark. Half a century later, Philip the Arab, the first emperor to ever get baptized publicly, was reissuing the same coin once again, but with his own face on it. This shows us that not all Roman emperors were opposed to Judeo-Christian culture, let alone were persecuting Christians. Only a small few did, such as Diocletian, but it also highlights the massive amount of influence that Eastern culture was beginning to have over the West. There are some scholars who think that Septimus Severus owned images of Jesus that were made by the Christian Carpocratian sect, the Marcellians, in the 2nd century. Many of the Severans were Christians themselves, including Julia Avita Mamaea, whose son Alexander Severus became the Roman emperor in 222. Septimus Severus marries Julia Domna in the year 187. Julia Domna was so famous and well connected that she was legally deified as a goddess and was given a statue of Athena in her honor. Julia Domna, who funded the Pythagorean Flavius Philostratus to write the famous Life of Apollonius of Tyana, also was born in Emesa, Syria, as a daughter of Julius Bassianus, the high priest of the Syrian Baal called Allah Gabal, god of the mountain. This specific name is a local Baal for Emesa, Syria, but was also representing a universal god who was solar and Mithraic, called Dii Invicti Solis Eligabili, unconquered sun god Elgabal. This god was represented by a black stone that was thought to have fell from heaven. This stone is worshipped as though it were sent from heaven. On it, there are some small projecting pieces and markings that are pointed out, which the people would like to believe are a rough picture of the sun, which this is how they seem. Herodian. One thing to note about that passage is the sun being pictured on the stone itself, showing that the solar traits of this god predate this cult being merged with the Roman Sol. What makes this god Mithraic is the priesthood itself. in Syria, local to the city of Emesa, as well as other cities throughout Mesopotamia and Central Asia, show evidence of sun-worshipping priests who are called magi. They have their roots from the Persian Achaemenid Empire, and Mithra was a solar mediator god and one of the 108 names of the sun from the Vedas, who mediated between forces of light and forces of darkness. Even all the way over in India, in the opposite direction, we have texts from a 6th century priest named Varhamahira from a family of sun-worshipping magi. Sun worship seems to have been a central rite in his family's religion, as his father, Aditya Dasa, name literally means slave or servant of the sun. The Magas, as they became to be known in India, originated from the Magi priest of the Achaemenid Empire. Mithra is central to this religion. Mithra is also found in the Persian Zendavesta, once again as a mediator who Zoroaster calls upon and prays to. Mithra in Persian theology has much overlap with that of Apollo in post-Augustan theology. Both of them are separate yet tied with the sun itself, and both are judiciary gods connected with truth and justice and oath binders. There are many who would try to argue that the Roman Mithras has nothing to do with the Persian Mithra. I think this is complete nonsense. First of all, in the archaeology, the votive altars show Persian loanwords. For example, Nama. The word for hell is Persian, and Nabartsi is seen here on this votive altar is also a Persian word that means victorious. These words are not just one small occurrence, but commonplace in the archaeology. Also, the Phrygian cap that Mithras wears in the Roman iconography signifies Eastern. Anyone wearing the Phrygian cap in Roman depictions is of Eastern provenance. Persian Mithra is shown with not only the Phrygian cap, but also with solar beams shining behind his head. So we have in this colossal statuary erected by King Antiochus from 69 to 34 BCE at Mount Nemrut, Mithra is shown beardless, wearing the Phrygian cap, and on the back of the thrones there is an inscription in Greek which includes the name Apollo Mithras Helios in the genitive case. Archaeologist R.D. Barnett has argued that the royal seal of King Sositar of the Mitanni Empire from the Bronze Age in 1450 BCE depicts a Mithra slaying a bull. The earliest known mention of the Indo-Aryan Mitra, referenced as Mitra, appears in a peace treaty around 1500 BCE. This treaty, inscribed between the Hittites and the Hurrian kingdom of Mitanni, located southeast of Lake Van in Asia Minor, includes Mitra along with 4 other Indic gods as witnesses and guardians of the agreement. In the Vedic tradition, Mitra holds a significant position as a deity in the Rig Veda. Particularly noted in Hymn 2 of Mandala 1, he is associated closely with Varuna. Both Mitra and Varuna are part of the Adityas, a collective of solar deities, a grouping that persists in later Vedic texts. Vedic Mitra is revered as the god overseeing honesty, friendship, contracts, and gatherings, but also daylight, imperial and mighty showerers, lords of heaven and earth, beholders of the universe. You approach Mitra and Varuna with variegated clouds to hear the sound of your praises, and cause the sky to send down rain by the power of the emitter of showers. Rig Veda. Vedic scholar Dr. Sayana says about this passage, Mitra is associated with the light of dawn and the morning sun, while Varuna becomes associated with the evening and ultimately night. In the Artha Veda, Mitra is associated with sunrise, and accordingly, Mitra is worshipped in the sunrise prayers of the Hindus. In the morning, Upasthana prayer recited to the risen sun after contemplation of the sacred Gayatri mantra is a collection of Vedic verses addressing Mitra. There is even a midwinter solstice festival known as the Mitrosavam, venerating Mitra as the sun. If that's not solar traits, then I don't know what is. Again, Mitra's name shows up as one of the 108 names of the Vedic sun. Also, researching for this video, I found deep in the Vedas a passage about Mithra that is tied to bull sacrifice, conquering, and victory. Yajur Veda 2 5.5 says, on the new moon, he should sacrifice with the clotted curds for Mitra and Varuna. On the full moon, the soma is pressed for the gods. During the half month, it is pressed forth for them. And a bull for Mitra and Varuna is to be slaughtered for them at the new moon. In that he drives away the calves, he metes out the seat and the oblation holder. In that he sacrifices at the new moon with the clotted curds for Mitra and Varuna. The bull, which is slaughtered for the gods, becomes his also. He mounts upon the gods in truth, who mounts upon their sacrifice. If he misses the mark, he becomes worse. If he does not, he remains so. For this sacrifice has a razor edge, and swiftly becomes holy or perishes. His vow is, he shall not speak untruth. He shall not eat meat. He shall not approach a woman. They shall not clean his raiment with cleansing stuff. For all these things the gods do not do. Not only are Mithras and Mithra 75% the same in their roles and functions, but even the sources themselves from the Neoplatonists living in that time period who follow the religion of Mithras also attest to this. The Neoplatonist pagan philosopher Porphyry, when discussing Mithras, states, indeed, among the Persians, those who have wisdom about the divine and servant are called magi, and this class is held by the Persians to be so great that Darius, son of Hystaspes, actually had this, among other things, engraved on his tomb. They were divided into 3 classes, as Eubolos records in the history of Mithras. And I think it's a good time to remind you that the Persians, since at least the time of Darius, who Porphyry just mentioned here, celebrated the birth of a solar Mithra at the winter solstice called Yalda night, which again becomes December 25th under the Julian calendar. The person who is initiated into the grade of the lion is invested with all sorts of animal forms. The reason for this is given by Pallas in his work on Mithras. He says the common opinion is that these things refer to the circle of the zodiac, that the real and accurate explanation is that they state allegorically something about human souls, which they, the Mithraists, say are incarnated in all sorts of bodies. Porphyry. The Persian Pallas, who he cites here, was writing during the reign of Hadrian, so the zodiacal Mithras was already imported at the time and had long been practiced in Roman religion since Pompey defeated the Sicilian pirates and added many Cappadocians and Phrygians to the Roman Empire. And during that time, Apollo and Sol were already merged since the time of Augustus, but the Syrian priesthood of this god, under the name Elagabalus, had some unique features. All it took was for this god to be imported into the Roman pantheon, for him to become the Super Apollo Sol Invictus god that we eventually find. Here's how it happens. Caesar Severus's wife, Roman Empress Julia Domna's sister, Julia Mesa, was the mother of the 13-year-old high priest of this god at Emesa, named Julius Bassianus. The story of how he became Caesar is one that is so fascinating that I think we should read it here.
Julia Domna, wife of Caesar Septimus Severus and mother of Caesar Caracalla, had a sister Mesa, Phoenician, named after the city of Emesa in that country. During her sister's imperial career, the many years that Severus and Caracalla were emperors, this woman lived in the imperial palace. After the assassination of Caracalla and Julia's death, Macrinus ordered Mesa to return to her own estates in Phoenicia, allowing her to live there in full possession of her property. Since Mesa had lived for a long time under imperial protection, she had amassed a huge personal fortune. Thus, the old woman now went off to live on her estates. Mesa had 2 daughters. The elder was called Julia Sohaemus. the younger Julia Mamaea. Each of the girls had an only son, so Haemus's son was named Bassianus, Mamaea's Alexianus. These boys were reared by their mothers and their grandmother, were at that time about 14 and 10 respectively. They were priests of the sun god, Sol, whom their countrymen worship under the Phoenician name El-Gabal. A huge temple was erected to this god, lavishly decorated with gold, silver, and costly gems. Not only is this god worshipped by the natives, but all the neighboring rulers and kings send generous and expensive gifts to him each year. No statue made by man in the likeness of the god stands in this temple, as in Greek and Roman temples. The temple does, however, contain a huge black stone with a pointed end and round base in the shape of a cone. The Phoenicians solemnly maintain that this stone came down from Zeus, pointing out certain small features in relief. They assert that it is an unwrought image of the sun, for naturally this is what they wish to see. Pausanias was the chief priest of this god. Since he was the elder of the boys, the priesthood had been entrusted to him. He went about in barbarian dress, wearing long-sleeved purple tunics embroidered with gold, which hung to his feet. Robes similarly decorated with gold and purple covered his legs from hip to toe, and he wore a golden ivy diadem of vari-colored precious gems. Pausanias, in the prime of youth, was the handsomest lad of his time, with physical beauty, bloom of youth, and splendor of attire combining to produce the same effect. The youth might well be compared to the handsome statues of Bacchus. When Pausanias was performing his priestly duties, dancing about the altars in barbarian fashion to the music of flutes, pipes, and every kind of instrument, the natives and the soldiers watched him with more than ordinary curiosity, aware that he belonged to the imperial family. His youthful beauty attracted the eyes of all. At that time, a huge army was quartered at Emesa to guard Phoenicia. This army was later transferred from the city. The soldiers were therefore frequent visitors in the city and went to the temple on the pretext of worshipping the god. There they delighted in watching Bassianus. Some were deserters and compatriots of Julia Mesa, while they stood admiring Bassianus. His mother, Julia Mesa, either inventing the story or telling the truth, informed them that Bassianus was really the son of Caesar, although it might appear that he had another father. She claimed that when she was living in the palace with her sister, Caesar Caracalla slept with both of her daughters, who were young and beautiful. The men repeated her story to their fellow soldiers, and it soon became common knowledge throughout the army. Mesa was rumored to be enormously wealthy, and it was reported that she would immediately give all her money to the soldiers if they restored the empire to her family. The soldiers agreed that if the family would come secretly to the camp at night, they would open the gates, receive the family inside, and proclaim Bassianus emperor and son of Caesar. The old woman agreed to the plan, preferring to risk any danger rather than live in obscurity and appear to have been discarded, and so she slipped unnoticed out of the city at night with her daughters and grandsons. The 16th May 218, guided by soldiers who had deserted, they came to the wall of the camp and were warmly received inside. Immediately, the entire army saluted Bassianus as son of Caesar, and wrapping him in a purple military cloak, held him inside the camp.
This god is represented by a constellation of Perseus slaying the bull, but also the sun itself. In some texts, he is equated with Jupiter. An author from the Historia Augusta writes about Bassianus. He writes, "He was also a priest of Heliogabalus, or Jove, or Sol." The same author claims that the rites of all Eastern religions were included into the Roman religion during this time. As soon as he entered the city, however, neglecting all the affairs of the provinces, he established Elagabalus as a god on the Palatine Hill, close to the imperial palace, and he built him a temple to which he desired to transfer the emblem of the Great Mother, the fire of Vesta, the Palladium, the shields of the Salii, all the Romans held sacred, proposing that no god might be worshipped at Rome save only Elagabalus. He declared furthermore that the religions of the Jews and the Samaritans and the rites of the Christians must also be transferred to this place in order that the priesthood of Elagabalus might include the mysteries of every form of worship. Solstice veneration was a big deal.
during the reign of Caesar Elagabalus. Herodian also tells stories about Elagabalus during each solstice, which would perform ritual chariot rides through the city of Rome, carrying the stone from Messa in the chariot through the sacred way, the Via Sacra, and into the Palatine Hill, where he would enter into a newly dedicated temple called the Elagabalium. The huge temple was located in front of the Colosseum, and the temple platform was originally built under Domitian between 81 and 96 in honor of Jupiter Optimus Maximus Heliopolitanus, the highest god with the solar face, who was also worshipped in Baalbek, Syria. Despite Elagabalus's horrible fate, we know his religious reforms were still popular for multiple reasons. One being that his immediate successor rededicated the temple, but dropped the name Elagabalus back to Jupiter. But other than that, the name of Elagabalus being dropped, I don't think there was any reason to suspect much else was being changed. Well, the stone was gone too, but as Alexander was also from the same Syrian family, the primary sources also maintain that Alexander was also very much in favor of Syrian and Eastern culture, and some sources even claiming that he was very tolerant to Jews and Christians as well. Severus Alexander had a very long reign after Elagabalus, from 222 to 235, the longest of anyone since Antonius Pius, and his death marked the beginning of the crisis of the 3rd century, which not much religious reforms happened during that time, but ended with Aurelian on top. A total of 15 emperors would come and go within a short span of 35 years. Aurelian would continue the trajectory of Sol Invictus as the head god of the Roman pantheon, though the name Elagabalus was long forgotten. However, the Mithraic elements would continue in the priesthood, as Mithras would continue to be popular for the soldiers and the legions, the same soldiers and the legions that made Elagabalus Caesar. In my own vague opinion, Sol Invictus was 1 part Jupiter Optimus Maximus and 1 part Solar Apollo, but also 1 part Mithras. But it would be too simple to say that this is 100% true. Here we could see a dedication made by a priest of Jupiter Dolichenes on behalf of the well-being of the emperors. To Sol Invictus and the genius of the military unit known as Equitus Singularis Augusti, the cavalry arm of the Praetorian Guard during the Principate period of Imperial Rome, dated to around 150 CE. As early as the 1st century, we see multiple inscriptions that use Invictus as an epithet for Sol. Invictus, unconquered or invincible, was also an epithet used for other Roman deities, including Jupiter, Mars, Hercules, Apollo, and Silvanus. Most of these gods were commonly portrayed in Roman Mithraeums across the Roman Empire, including the god Saturn too, who, like Mithras, played a special role in initiation. Both Sol Invictus and Saturn played prominent roles in the Mithraic mysteries, and Sol was equated with Mithras, even though they're also depicted as separate. Mithras slaying the bull, or tauroctony, is an image that was at one time used for the goddess Nike slaying the bull, as I'm showing here. As you can see here, the bull looks exactly the same. The iconography of Nike slaying the bull stretches back to ancient Greek classical period. Bull slaying rites were something central to the priesthood of Magna Mater in Rome, who would perform ritual bull sacrifice in the temple, in which an initiate would stand under a secret room where the blood from the bull would rain down on them, and they would be ritually washed from the blood of the sacrifice. Similar imagery is invoked in Christianity, with saved souls being washed in the blood of the Lamb, who is Christ. These rites of Magna Mater date back to 200 BCE, when they imported Magna Mater from Asia Minor, and like Elagabalus, she also brought with her a secret stone that fell from heaven too, something to note there. An image of a man slaying a bull was discovered in Dacia, modern day of Romania. On the helmet There are some who will argue that the bull slayer hero is an early Mithra or even Perseus due to the hat looking somewhat like a Phrygian cap, but I don't think this is so. However, this image is still connected to the Mithraic tauroctony in a different way, but even stranger in my opinion. Here we see Attis Mithras synced together. The Mithra Attis of Ponticapium is dated to sometime in the Hellenistic era. Some even say that this is neither Attis or Mithras, but Eros in Oriental dress. Whoever the deity is, it agrees with Macrobius over half a century later, who syncs them all anyway. He is dressed in a pair of trousers and a jacket, leaving the stomach and genitals uncovered. He grabs the bull under control with one knee, grasping one of its horns, one hand, and the knife raised high. The opposite side is said to have a triangular fire hole. As we see, Attis certainly depicted in similar fashion here in the 1st century BCE. Also, Eros Harpocrates, a Hellenized version of the god Horus from Egypt, from the same era, 1st century BCE, looks almost identical to Attis. The mixed conclusions to who the previous bull slayer is understandable, but it also brings a lot of context as to how these sons of God saviors became synced by the Romans. If we look at the image of Mithras slaying the bull here. Now, remember when I said that the bull slayer on the Dacian helmet could still be related to Mithras, even if it's not Mithras, but in a weirder way. This is why I said that. It's very hard to see, but scholars have found Latin text on the bull that is being slayed. The text reads, Nama Sabazio, also Dio Soli Invicto Mithrae. Now, the image blew my mind right off of my head when I saw this for the first time, because if you watch my video about the roots of Dionysus, you would know that Sabazius or Sabazio is the most ancient Thraco-Phrygian/Hittite Bronze Age version of the god Dionysus. And Zalmoxis, who some think is depicted on the Dacian helmet in iconography, as well as being the son of Semele, tied to Semele, both meaning earth, is also a distant relative of this ancient god worshipped by the Dacians. I still don't know how to interpret this, but maybe this could be a topic for another day. Regardless, as we see here with this Cretan drachma from 500 BCE, Hercules is slaying the bull. This typical iconography for the savior god conquering the elements of nature. Also, Hercules can be noted to have solar traits as well. The other inscription on the Mithraic one, Dio Soli Invicto Mithrae. This is just one of the numerous examples of Sol Invictus and Mithra being together in the same title. Another Greek inscription from the Common Era states, Good fortune to Sol Invictus Mithras in the priesthood of Ulio Severus governor. The following contributed to the building of the sacred cave and displayed their piety. And again, in another inscription with both Greek and Latin from the 1st century in Latin, to Sol Invictus Mithras, donated by Titus Flavius Hyginus Ephiabanus, freedman of the emperor. And then in Greek, to Helios Mithras Titus Flavius Hyginus, through Lollius Rufus his father. Once again, Sol Invictus Mithras, all in one name. Also in the Greek, instead of Invictus, we see Adamas. To Zeus Helios Megas Adamas Mithras. Zeus Helios, great invincible Mithras. And the deities dwelling with him were given 2 bronze lamps, each with 6 wicks, by Castus father and Castus son, holy raven, and dedicated with the following attendants: Lucius Saturius Sporus and Pactumius Lassus Pater Modestus. That same word, Adamas, both Plato and Empedocles use this word to describe the elements that the demiurge uses to create life with. It is also the word that Hesiod uses to describe the sickle of Kronos Saturn, which he uses to castrate his father Ouranos, heaven. And the same Adamas sickle is used by Perseus to slay Medusa. Both the virgin-born Perseus and Saturn are heavily tied to Mithras Sol Invictus in the Mithraic Roman religion. Saturn, according to Ovid in his Metamorphosis, is the demiurge who created and separates the cosmos. Saturn, who takes the kingdom of heaven from Ouranos, is the Sky King, while Ops is the Earth Mother. So the winter solstice and the sky god Sol Invictus is by default linked. night. Even though Saturn is deposed by Jupiter and cast down to the underworld, in Latin mythology, the entrance to the underworld is at Latium in Italy, and this can be accessed only during the week of the winter solstice, known as Brumalia, or in the case of the Roman world, this is when Saturnalia takes place. During the rest of the year, Saturn rules Elysium in Hades and is thus called Dis Pater, or Father Infernal. This god can be best described as a Bacchic Saturnian Hades, similar to the Germanic Odin, but you can't separate Saturnalia from the winter solstice nor the new year. They are all connected, Janus being two-faced, looking back and forward, and Saturn being celebrated just before the solstice during the darkest days of the year when the underworld and the overworld collide. Saturn, closely associated with Janus, is linked to transitional points such as beginnings and endings, including sunrise and sunset and doorways. He is often depicted as a hooded god, typically shown with a cowl, and his festival, Saturnalia, is connected with the wearing of masks. During Saturnalia, it was customary to light wax tapers in Saturn's honor, a shift from previous rituals, and to carry small masks to the Chapel of Dis near Saturn's altar, replacing the earlier practice of offering human heads. This led to the tradition of distributing wax tapers during Saturnalia and selling little clay figures as propitiatory offerings to Saturn for one's family. Saturn's close link to Dis Pater is evident, with rituals of human sacrifice shared between them, and both deities sharing a sacred space. The altar of Dis was part of the same temple that also served as the Roman state treasury. This association possibly led to the blending of Dis and Saturn into a single entity in some beliefs, and the name Dis Pater could be interpreted as referring to both. Brumalia was dedicated to Bacchus and Proserpina, and they practiced planting seeds in the dirt with dung on this very day. According to Pliny the Elder, John of Litus tells us that farmers would sacrifice pigs to Saturn and Ceres. Vine growers would sacrifice goats in honor of Bacchus, for the goat is an enemy of the vine, and attendants would bring offerings of firstfruits to the priest of Proserpina. Proserpina is the virgin called Kori, who gives birth to Ion in Egyptian mythology. Dis Pater and Proserpina are king and queen of the underworld, and the most honored during this week when the underworld and the earth were thought to be in overlap of each other. The festival prohibited battle for several reasons. Saturn's reign was seen as peaceful, devoid of war, because it coincided with the opening of the underworld, and thus was a sacred time dedicated to Father Dis and Proserpina. It was deemed inauspicious to wage war when the jaws of Pluto were opened, symbolizing an open door to the grim, infernal deities of the underworld. The Saturnalia's focus on the worship of these infernal gods and spirits suggests it may have been seen as a time when the underworld's portals were open, a concept paralleled in Gaelic tradition of Samhain, who also practiced similar rites of gift-giving and wearing masks. The notion that Saturn was the father of the Latin people is an original Roman idea, later overshadowed by Greek-influenced stories about Aeneas. Even in tales of Aeneas, Saturn is acknowledged as the ancestral god voluntarily revered by the Latins. This idea mirrors Julius Caesar's account of the Celts, who claimed descent from a deity and marked time by nights, not days, hinting at a similar belief in Saturn as an ancestor. Other Italic peoples believed Mars fathered Picos, making Mars their ancestral deity. Macrobius mentions an annual ritual for a departed soul, followed by a day dedicated to Jupiter, believed to give and receive souls after death. This festival, dated December 23rd, concludes the Saturnalia with offerings to the dead, continuing the theme of Saturn's connection with the deceased. Gladiatorial games believed by some to be blood sacrifices to the god, which were traditionally held during Saturnalia, Saturnalia and at large funerals, similar to the funeral games in Greek epics and Gaelic traditions involving martial contests. If Saturn is considered an ancestral figure, he would reside with the dead in the afterlife, in Elysium, making rituals for him associated with the dead and their gods and spirits. Saturnalia encompasses these features, and its timing at the sun's lowest point suggests an underworld link. Caesar mentions the Celtic deities in relation to the night sky, seen as the underworld, and the focus on the North Star align with this idea. In Macrobius' Saturnalia, Saturn is revered above all other gods, reflecting the festival's popularity and scale, again to the Gaelic Samhain, which also is a New Year's festival too. Makes you wonder if they borrowed the same rites but applied them to their own New Year festival. I mean, Saturnalia, some people will say, is not the New Year's festival, but it's the pre-winter solstice New Year's festival, while the Calends of Janus is the post-winter solstice New Year. They're both New Year's festivals in their own way. As I'm trying to describe in this video, you cannot separate Saturnalia from the winter solstice, from Brumalia, or from the Calends of Janus, the double-sided face. They are all connected in this magical time of December. Its alignment with the winter solstice and potential ancient connections with similar European festivals such as Yule further emphasize its significance and widespread cultural impact. Brumalia, December 25th, is the beginning of the new sun and the end of the old one. Ovid, Fasti. Saturn was chiefly honored during Saturnalia festival, celebrated during this time, the week before the Brumalia, from at least the 5th century BCE, but some sources suggest that it is old as Rome itself, predating even the Etruscans and the Villanovan culture. This festival, which spans several days, the sources highlight how people look forward to gift-giving and the temporary freedoms granted to the slaves, the wearing of less formal attire instead of togas, and widespread revelry, making it the most joyous Roman celebration by far. Its vivacity led the poet Catullus to call it the best of times. Over the time, Saturnalia evolved into the Brumalia festival, as I've been saying, originally venerated for Bacchus, just like the Lesser Dionysia is in Greece, and Ceres and Apollo as well, but which later blended with the veneration of Mithras and Sol Invictus, especially after Augustan priests synced Apollo with Sol, and then even more so after the 2nd and 3rd centuries when the Severan dynasty Elagabalus established Eastern customs into the Roman religion and Sol became the head of the pantheon. This time of year was eventually replaced by Christmas, which survives until the fall of the Roman Empire of the East, and its features and the shift of its observance to later in December and later centuries have vast influence on the customs of Christmas. And this is the part that everyone misses. They think that, oh, December, Saturnalia ends on the 23rd, then therefore how could it have any influence over Christmas? That is false. Saturnalia rites blend in with Brumalia, which is a winter solstice festival which continues all the way into the 11th century in the Eastern Roman Empire. Every year, someone from the plebeian class, usually a slave, would be chosen by lot to be the king of Saturnalia and would thus reverse the roles of the classes for the time, giving a slave a chance to live like a king and for the masters a time to serve their slave. Brumalia, however, was an extension to this magical time period and the middle point between Saturnalia and the New Year's Calends of Janus, the remnants of Saturn's temple. We know this because we know that New Year's celebrations across Europe had these same Saturnalia-like rites being practiced, as if the week was just shifted to the end of the month. The remnants of Saturn's temple sit atop a base of travertine blocks and are constructed from the materials repurposed from older temples. The structure features Ionic columns with 8 still standing on the northern side. These columns are crafted from Egyptian granite with pink granite from Aswan for the side columns and gray granite from Mons Claudianus for those on the facet, highlighting their varied origins. 3 columns are single pieces, while others are made from 2 fitted sections. The Ionic capitals, the only parts explicitly made for the temple, are carved from Thasian marble in a typical late antique style. The architrave are adorned with Ionic frieze of acanthus leaves and palmatis, originated from the site's previous temple built by Julius Caesar's general Lucius Mutianus Plancus in 43 BCE, using spoils from the Syrian campaigns. This temple, in many ways, was the symbol of Rome's dominance over the Mediterranean world, and with the addition of the Syrian columns, marking its now dominance over the Mesopotamian world too. Saturn continued to remain mysterious, secretive, and highly venerated, even in later times when the Mithraic religion of Sol Invictus dominated the Roman imperial cult. The highest grade of initiation, the pater, was symbolized by Mithra's cap and Saturn's sickle. These are the 7 grades of initiation. 1. Mercury, raven, with the cap and the caduceus of Mercury. 2. Venus, male bride, with a lamp and diadem of Venus. 3. Mars, soldier's kit bag with lance and helmet of Mars. 4. Jupiter, lion, with sacred sistrum and thunderbolt of Jupiter. 5. Moon, Persian sickle with the crescent moon. 6. Sun, with torch, whip, and halo of sun. 7. Saturn, father's staff and bowl, and Mithras Phrygian cap, and Saturn's scythe. Hail to the Sunrunners under the protection of Sol. Hail to the Persians under the protection of Luna. Hail to the Lions under the protection of Jupiter. Hail to the fierce soldiers under the protection of Mars. Hail to the male brides under the protection of Venus. It is suggested that the highest rank of Saturn, the pater rank, is not mentioned in this inscription due to its secrecy. The final and most exclusive level of attainment was the bond between Saturn and Mithras, the most secretive and most prominent level of initiation. It was known that the last high priest or hierophant of the Eleusinian mysteries was himself a pater, level 7 initiate of the Mithraic mysteries, as these high-ranking initiates were in the highest levels of society. Dedicated by Valerius Heracles in the year 190, a statue of Mithraic Kronos, also called Ion, Phanes, or Zervan Arcarna. Ion is the same name given to the god who was born of a virgin on the winter solstice, December 25th, who was worshipped in Egypt according to Epiphanius. This statue was found at Ostia in Italy, a lion phallic-like statue entwined 6 times by a serpent, the head which rests at the skull of the god. 4 wings, similar to El of the Phoenicians, decorated the symbols of the seasons, denoting the solstices and equinoxes. Each hand holds a key, and in his right hand a scepter, the symbol of authority in ancient Persia, and a thunderbolt engraved on his breast. On the base of the statue may be seen the hammer and tongs of Vulcan, denoting the craftsman or demiurgic power of Saturn, the cock and pine cone, consecrated to Attis, Bacchus, or Asclepius, as well as Sol Invictus, and the wand of Mercury, all characteristics of Mithraic Saturn, who is the embodiment of the power of all the gods, the All-Father Saturn. In similar fashion, found at Rome, the Mithraic Saturn stands on top of the world, as well as the image of Mithraic Saturn found in Florence. In that same location, in Rome as the former, another bas-relief of white marble shows a Mithraic Saturn clothed in white trousers, the arms extended, and in each hand holds a torch, the image of Lucifer, the light bearer. Once again, the 4 wings, as seen usually with Saturn or Phoenician El, and coiled by 2 serpents. He stands by a circular altar of burning hearth fire, and his breath extends the fire of the altar. The Mithraic temple at Ostia was designed with an inner sanctum like a holy of holies, which held the images of Saturn, Mithras, and Silvanus. Silvanus, as we see in this image, a god of rustic nature, somewhat of a cross between Dionysus and Pan, who looks strikingly Christ-like here. The mosaic stood in a vestibule near the baptism room where sacred baths were carried out, and this temple was also conjoined to a sanctuary of the Great Mother, Magna Mater. It was constructed in 162 during the reign of Antonius Pius. The iconography found all over the Mithraeums show Kronos or Saturn, who was equated by the Persians as Zorvan in Zoroastrian thought, the father of time, who is above even Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu. And the Mithraic Kronos holds the keys to the upper and lower worlds, and has the serpent of wisdom coiled around him as he stands with the earth at his footstool. You cannot separate Saturnalia from the winter solstice. Whether it's Brumalia or Dies Natalis Solis Invicti Festival would not make a difference. This month of December was a magical time, and it always has been. This was known to the Christians before they decided to calculate his birthday. In the year 274, Emperor Aurelian established the Dies Natalis Solis Invicti Festival, translating to the birthday of the unconquered sun on December 25th, aligning with the winter solstice on the Roman calendar. This annual celebration in Rome included an impressive 30 chariot races. According to Gary Forsyth, a professor of ancient history, this festival was a delightful extension to the Saturnalia from December 17th to the 23rd, which was the most festive time in Rome since the days of the Republic, marked by revelry, feasting, and giving gifts. Further, in 362, Emperor Aurelian mentioned in his hymn to King Helios that Agon Solis, a sun festival, took place at the conclusion of the Saturnalia in late December. Most of the religious rites of the Mithraic religion was done in secrecy, and not much written down in text survived outside of inscriptions and the Greek magical papyri. We do, however, have a few valuable sources from hostile witnesses, the Christian church fathers, who we can examine and take with a grain of salt to help us unpack the mystery of this religion. It is thought that the initiates into the mysteries of Mithras, blindfolded, head shaved, and taken naked inside a dark cave to go through a mock death and resurrection ritual. Moreover, what about the ludicrous performance that they experience blindfold in the cave? They are blindfolded in case their eyes shudder at being so disgustingly degraded. Some, like a bird, flap their wings, imitating the cry of a raven. Some roar like lions. Some have their hands bound by chicken gut and are cast over pits full of water. While some, who calls himself the Liberator, comes up with a sword and breaks his gut. Pseudo-Augustine. Sources like these remind me of close proximity the Roman Mithras cult is to the Orphic mystery religions of Bacchus, secret initiation and displays of divine mania. The initiation takes place in a cave, a veritable camp of darkness. A garland or crown is offered to the novice on a sword, a kind of mockery of martyrdom. It is then fitted on his head, but he is instructed to put his hand in the way and cast it from his head, transferring it, if possible, to his shoulder, saying that Mithras is his garland, and from then on he never wears a garland, and this is the mark of his initiation. Whenever he is put to the test at the oath-taking, and is immediately recognized as a soldier of Mithras, if he casts aside the garland, if he says that the garland lies in his god, Tertullian. Underneath the church of Santa Prisca in Rome is an ancient Mithraeum with astrological inscriptions, and a hole in the wall allows sunlight to reach the place where Mithras abode, is dwelling above the underworld, where we can see the face of the chthonic god Serapis, also equated with the god Dis Pater, a Mithraic cameo showing the miracle birth of Mithra from a rock between the Dioscuri, surrounded by secret Mithraic symbols, among them the cup and bread of the Eucharist. As Plutarch states, the great majority and the wisest of men hold this opinion. They believe that there are two gods, rivals as it were, the one the artificer of good and the other of evil. There are also those who call the better one a god and the other a daemon. Zoroaster the Magus, who, they record, lived 5,000 years before the time of the Trojan War, he called the one Ahura Mazda and the other Ahriman, and he further declared that among all these things perceptible to the senses, Ahura Mazda may best be compared to light, and Ahriman conversely to darkness, and midway between the two is Mithras. For this reason the Persians give to Mithras the name of mediator. Zoroaster, he has also taught men the rites of the Eucharist for Ahura Mazda, and averting morning offerings to Ahriman. They pound up in a mortar a certain plant called haoma, at the same time invoking Hades and darkness. Then they mix it with the blood of a wolf that has been sacrificed and carry it out and cast it into the place where the sun never shines. The birth of Mithras is one that has wide-ranging views and debate. We don't really know much about it other than what the iconography says and what we know about the Persians celebrating Yalda night on the winter solstice, which could very well point to Mithras having been born at this time. But it's also a very nuanced concept to say that Mithras and Sol are one. There is a claim that 3 PhDs in the field hold: Iranian mythology scholar Mary Boyce, PhD, author of The Mysteries of Mithras, Payam Nabar's PhD, and Dr. Karen Rawls of UC Berkeley, who all concur that there is a Seleucid-era inscription from around 200 BCE that states, Anahita, the Immaculate Virgin Mother of the Lord Mithra. I was not able to find an image of this inscription, but I don't think they're lying either. Other than that, we do have quite a few images of Mithras being born from a rock. A bas-relief found in the crypt of St. Clement's at Rome under a rock. Dagger in one hand, torch in the other. Then there is the bas-relief of Mithras born of a rock holding grapes, which replaces the Persian haoma drink found in a villa in Italy. In this image, a naked Mithra emerges from the cosmic egg, surrounded by the zodiac, as always carrying a torch and a dagger. Patrigenia househeads northern Italy near France. But even if we just aligned Mithras with Sol and went with what Macrobius says in Saturnalia, that too is much more nuanced. However, regardless of the time of his birth, I think the winter solstice would still be important to Mithras, just for the simple fact that this god is zodiacal and solar. In this depiction here, we can put together scenes from the life of Mithras. Mithras is with Sol. He is crowning Sol with a radiant halo, then ascending in a solar chariot to heaven and smiting the rock from which the waters of life flowed. Here we have Mithras and Sol lounging together and enjoying a feast. And some depictions of Mithras show him carrying the bull like Christ carries his cross. Mithras' painful journey was a symbol of human sufferings. Like Christ, after all, he was a savior.
Now that we've demonstrated how important this time period was to the Romans, not only the winter solstice of December 25th, but just this time of the year in general, December, as a time of merrymaking, gift-giving, revelry, decorating the halls with greenery and hanging wreaths. You have probably heard millions of times, especially around this time of the year, that December 25th, which was the winter solstice during the Roman Empire when the Julian calendar was in use, was chosen as the birthday of Christ in an attempt to steal the birthday of Mithras, or Sol Invictus, or Horus, or something to that effect. And you probably also heard, equally as annoying, from either Christian apologists or some smug academics or wannabe intellectuals, that this is in fact a lie, and that the oldest mention of Christ's birthday on December 25th actually predates Sol Invictus's birthday. Now, depending on who told you this, you were probably misled, because the academic papers that they claim to cite don't actually say this. They only say that the feast dates of Sol Invictus, issued by Aurelian in 276, in fact, after Christians calculated Jesus' birthday in 236, citing Hippolytus as the earliest to calculate these dates. But what they don't talk about is, who cares about a feast date? Sol Invictus and the winter solstice was already thriving long before Hippolytus was even alive. Let me circle back to that after I explain the calculation theory by Hippolytus. Hippolytus's canist. Hippolytus places the Passion of Christ on Friday, March 25th, which, according to Hippolytus's calculations, occurred in 29 CE. Then a second note on the same table states that the Genesis of Christ occurred on April 2nd of 2 BCE. For some reason, nobody brings that blaring contradiction up, although they are in effect in the academic paper written by Nothaft, which all these Christians like to cite without ever mentioning that. Those are the facts. Also a fact is the rise of the sun god in Roman religion from the Severan dynasty long before Hippolytus wrote this. And in 220 AD, Elagabalus decreed Dii Invicti Soli Elagabali as the head of the Roman pantheon. This is before Hippolytus wrote the Chronicon in 336, which is the other text that is needed to make the argument for the calculation theory. Chronicon, another text written in 336 by Hippolytus, says the following.
From Adam until the transmigration into Babylon under Jeconiah, 57 generations, 4,842 years, 9 months. And after the transmigration into Babylon, until the generation of Christ, there were 14 generations, 660 years. And from the generation of Christ until the Passion, there were 30 years. And from the Passion up until this year, which is the year 13 of the Emperor Alexander, there are 206 years. Therefore, all the years from Adam up until year 13 of the Emperor Alexander makes 5,738 years. Hippolytus, Chronicon.
So what just happened here? Well, it is argued through speculation that the 9 months was added to signify a gestation period, which makes Jesus born 9 months after the world was created, in which we need to jump to another text called the Pascha Computus of 243 to see that Christians in that time believed the world was created at the spring equinox, and therefore Jesus, using speculation about what Hippolytus may have thought, and also ignoring the text from Hippolytus himself that says he was conceived on April 2nd, and then, only then, we get an earlier date for December 25th, Jesus' birthday. And this is what annoys me so much about this whole topic. It is perfectly fine to do all these calculations and wild speculations about a theory that moves the Christian December 25th birthday of Jesus back a few measly months, and Christians celebrate this as a victory over Aurelian's later feast date while ignoring how the solstices and equinoxes never had feast days to begin with, but were nevertheless always listed on pagan calendars and noted by the ancients as long as records show. For some weird reason, any speculation about the winter solstice being an important date to a literal sun cult venerating a literal solstice is somehow going too far and needs more evidence, like some sort of conspiracy. But placing all of these 9-month calculation games and speculating on what Hippolytus thought, completely fine. We know Christians repurposed pagan temples, old Mithraeums, and built churches over old pagan sites, and we know that Christians went even as far as making up stories about Demeter telling her priests to worship Jesus, the story of Saint Demetrius, so they can co-opt what was left of the Eleusinian mysteries. And get this, in a letter from the year 395, the early Christian church father Jerome says,
Bethlehem, which is now under our control, was once eclipsed by a Tammuz grove, also known as Adonis. It was in this very cave where Christ as an infant once wept that the mournful rites for Venus's consort were conducted.
This particular cave was apparently transformed into the location of the Church of the Nativity. The point I'm trying to make is, we know that the early church was notorious for repurposing ancient pagan sites, festivals, and ideas into Christian ones. I am in no way saying that Christians are secret pagans. I'm not saying that. I'm only pointing out the painfully obvious fact that the early church did what it had to do in order to transfer over cultural norms in the smoothest way possible. That December 25th was another example of the church purifying a popular tradition so they can co-opt it like they did elsewhere. And as far as Saturnalia traditions go, the dates 17th to the 23rd are beside the point. The rituals during the month of December, leading into the calends of January, which is also a time of festivities, is clear to me that these traditions held on within the lower classes in the empire and beyond. To me, that is just common sense. And I credit the church for keeping that time of the year a special time. The earliest sources suggest, with overwhelming evidence, that this date was altered from January 6th, with the conception taking place in early April, either the 2nd or the 6th, and then was altered or shifted to December 25th and April 25th to align with the solstice and equinox. Bishop Epiphanius of Salamis writes that on April 6th, the Lamb was shut up in the spotless womb of the Holy Virgin, he who took away and takes away in perpetual sacrifice the sins of the world. Even today, the Armenian Church celebrates the Annunciation in early April and Christmas on January 6th. The oldest mention of Christ's birthday being celebrated at all comes from Clement of Alexandria. Around 200, Clement of Alexandria wrote, "But all the followers of Basilides celebrate the Epiphany, the day of his baptism too, spending the previous night in readings, and they say that it was on the 15th of the month of Tybe, of the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar, and some say that it was observed the 11th of the same month." The Egyptian dates given correspond to January 6th and 10th. Basilides was a Gnostic from Alexandria, and he was in close proximity with the Carpocratians and the Simonians. And it was here in Alexandria that January 6th was the date that Christ's birthday was celebrated. Late into the 5th century, this would continue, eventually following suit with the December 25th change that was taking over in the church. The word Epiphany is used in reference to Christ's birth and the visit from the Magi, both being at the same time. To me, this is clear that the motivation behind the shift was to make Christ's birth into cosmic harmony with the solstice, and possibly to counter Sol Invictus, who was Christ's main rival at the time period. Both the calculation theory and the more older theories about Sol Invictus have much overlap and can easily coexist as both being true. I still don't know why many can't see this obvious truth. It is not until the chronography of 354 that we get a clear reference to Jesus' birthday on December 25th, long after Aurelian, and what would seem like light years away from the rise of Sol during the 2nd century.
Christus in Bethlehem, Judea, December 25th. Christ is born in Bethlehem. Chronography of 354.
The church father Ambrose, around 390, for example, described Christ as the true Son who outshone the fallen gods of the old order. Syriac biblical commentator Dionysius Barsalabi states that in ancient times, the Christmas holiday was actually shifted from January 6th to December 25th, just as I demonstrated, so that it fell on the same date as the pagan Sol Invictus holiday. Puritans in later times would reject Christmas as Roman paganism and made laws that outlawed any festival during this month and kept businesses running, in opposition to the spirit of the Roman Saturnalia and New Year's festival of Janus. This level of nuanced opinions about this date suggests that this was clearly a late idea that was clearly known to be related to December festivities and the solstice. I don't know how clear it can get, to be honest. In fact, remember the ritual that I mentioned earlier about the slave who would pretend to be a king or a leader of the household for the day, known as the King of Saturnalia? In 400 AD, Asterius of Amasia, a Christian bishop and historian, complained about Christians practicing the mock king ritual and gift-giving, and also other Saturnalia rituals that Christians were adopting in his time. But it goes beyond his era in the 5th century Roman Empire that just recently was converted from a pagan empire to a Christian one. Would it shock you to know that Christians in Germany, Scandinavia, and England, known as the Lord of Misrule or Abbot of Unreason in Scotland, and in France, the Prince des Sots, a medieval practice of a civilian appointed by lot during Christmastide to preside over the Feast of Fools. The Lord of Misrule was generally a peasant chosen to be in charge of Christmas revelries, which often included drunkenness, wild partying, and the barons and jarls were to play along as if they were the peasants for the day. This is in no doubt influenced by Saturnalia's King of Saturnalia. In fact, when Christian apologists wave this off as just general merrymaking, or just not enough evidence to prove this was influenced from Saturnalia, I have to wonder with amazement if they actually believe themselves. It's one thing to argue that merrymaking during a festival is just a general way to celebrate any festival. But here we are with something so specific as the making a peasant into a king and the reversing of roles. Not only is this exactly the same as the King of Saturnalia, but it's during the same time of the year, celebrated by people living in the same part of the world. People who also have statues of the Roman emperors like Caesar, still standing as heroes to the European folk, who use the same Latin alphabets as the pagan Romans did, travel on the same roads built by Romans, live in the same cities, who, even as Christians, they still paint the old gods like Saturn and Venus and Mars, painted so beautifully by the Renaissance painters. Do you think these people just forgot about their cultural roots? To deny the cultural exchanges and inspirations is to just deny the cultural milieu of the Western world itself, and to show lack of any knowledge on this subject. This is not only a Saturnalia and Calends of Janus rite, but it also is practiced by Europeans in the Middle Ages for the months of December, along with the mock king ritual. And yet, to prove this even more, we can examine the pagans of Ireland practicing similar New Year celebrations, which were practiced in the days of ancient Rome during the Calends of January, but for the eve of the Samhain festival, which is the New Year celebration for the ancient Celts, passed down to the Irish, and then makes its way into the New World in Halloween in America. The ritual of having children go from house to house and trade gifts. This festival teaches even little children, artless and simple, to be greedy, and accustoms them to go from house to house and offer novel gifts. Fruits covered with silver tinsel. For these they receive, in return, gifts double their value, and thus the tender minds of the young begin to be impressed with that which is commercial and sordid. Asterius. Just for context, All Hallows Eve, or All Saints' Day, was originally celebrated in the month of April all the way up into the late 8th century, and then Samhain, which was still the New Year celebration for the existing pagans of Ireland at this time, and after the Franks were established as the new Holy Roman Empire by Charlemagne being anointed by the Pope, Elcuin of Northumbria, a member of Charlemagne's court, introduced November 1st as the new date for All Saints' Day in the Frankish Empire in 835. It became the official date in the Frankish Empire, another clear example of the church co-opting existing pagan culture and purifying pagan rites. To further demonstrate this, in a text known as the Song of Roland, we have a letter from Charlemagne to pagan Celts living in Spain and France, telling them to convert to Christianity or be wiped off the earth. They were given no choice. The bard that wrote this text brags and boasts about how the pagans were completely genocided and wiped off the planet. Merry and bold is now the emperor. The walls are tumbled down. His catapults have battered down and towered. Great good treasure his knights have placed in a pound silver and gold, and many a jeweled gown. In that city there is no pagan now, but he been slain, or takes the Christian vow. Franks shall be slain, and France abased be. To Charles the Old, with his great blossoming beard, all France we shall have seized, till we can lie in the burg of Saint Denis. The pagan king has bowed his head deep down. Then, in a later text known as the Archaeology na Signorach, Tales of the Elders of Ireland, St. Patrick is depicted with druids performing miracles on Samhain. And in this text, St. Patrick is not bothered by the druids practicing their rites and celebrating their holiday, and thus illustrating the co-opting of All Saints' Day with Samhain and druidic culture. And this is perfectly in step with Paul's philosophy, allowing Christians to eat meat sacrificed to idols. As Paul states about eating food sacrificed to idols, we know that an idol is nothing at all in the world, and that there is no God but one. For even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, and indeed there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is but one God, the Father, from whom all things came and from whom we live. And there is but one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom all things came and through whom we live. 1 Corinthians 8. And then Paul says, to the Jews I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law I became like the one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, as to win those under the law. To those not having the law I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but I'm under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that by all means possible I might save some. 1 Corinthians 9. In the year 604 of the Common Era, Pope Gregory I sent a letter to the Bishop of London, Abbot Mellitus. This is what he said.
After long deliberation about the English people, pagan temples of that race should by no means be destroyed, but only the idols in them. To consecrate these places, take holy water and sprinkle it in these shrines. Build altars and place relics in them. For if the shrines are well built, it is essential that they should be changed from the worship of devils to the service of the true God. So on the day of dedication, or the festivals of the holy martyrs, whose relics are deposited there, let the pagans make themselves huts from the branches of trees around the churches, which have been converted out of shrines, and let them celebrate in their own solemnity with religious feasts. The rites they once performed to the devil, let them perform to the true God, for there is no doubt that it is impossible to cut off everything at once from their rude natures, because he who endeavors to ascend to the highest place rises by degrees or steps, and not by leaps.
In my opinion, this strategy of co-opting pagan rites and Christianizing them and purifying them is ripped straight from the playbook of Paul himself, who says, I am a Jew to the Jews so I may win over the Jews, and I am a Gentile to the Gentile so I may win over the Gentiles. I'm under the law to those who are under the law so I can win over those under the law, and then I'm not under the law for those who are not under the law so I can win over those not under the law. This was the blueprint laid out by Paul that allowed Christianity to co-opt and purify the pagan world in which they came out